Say My Name and Burn, a dark romance novel. Prologue. The Rule. Callum. They say your life flashes before your eyes when you die. They're wrong. It's not your whole life. It's just the parts that mattered, the parts you fought for, the parts you lost. And if you were very stupid, or very brave, or some unholy combination of both, it's her. Just her. Always. Only her. Nimes, wimes, bray. The room was white. Not hospital white. Not the warm, antiseptic cream of a GP's office, or the yellowed white of an old kitchen. This was a different species of white entirely. Clinical. Absolute. The kind of white that existed solely to make you feel like a stain on its surface. It swallowed sound. It swallowed depth. It swallowed the edges of things until the walls and the ceiling and the floor became one seamless, featureless void. And the only object with any dimension at all was the chair I was strapped to. Metal, bolted to the floor. My wrists were secured with padded restraints, leather and medical-grade nylon, the kind designed to hold a body without leaving marks. Thoughtful. The Covenant was always thoughtful about the details. They'd break your mind and leave your skin pristine, present you back to the world like an undamaged parcel, all the destruction tucked neatly inside where no one would think to look. My head was tilted back, something cold pressed against my temples, twin discs of metal, smooth, precise, electrodes. I could feel the faint hum of current behind them, not yet activated, just waiting, patient, like a held breath before a scream. I stared at the ceiling, counted the seconds, lost count. Started again. Coys. Coys, coys, coys. Coys, 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 coys. Coys, coys. Toys, coys. The door opened without sound. No creak, no click, no pneumatic hiss. Just a seam of shadow splitting the white, and then Silas Crane was in the room. He didn't rush. He never rushed. That was the thing about Crane that made your skin crawl long before your brain could articulate why. The man moved through the world as if time were a courtesy extended to him personally, as if the clock itself wouldn't dare tick without his permission. He was tall, thin in the way of men who forgot to eat because they found the act pedestrian, and dressed in a charcoal suit that probably cost more than most people's cars. His hair was silver, cropped close, military, neat. His eyes were the pale gray of winter sky over the North Sea, flat, vast, containing nothing warm. He pulled a chair from somewhere. I didn't see where. The room seemed to produce furniture for him like a magic trick, and sat down exactly 4 feet from me. Close enough to speak without raising his voice, far enough that I couldn't reach him even if I tried. He'd calculated the distance. Of course he had. Callum. My name in his mouth sounded like a diagnosis. Callum, look at me. I kept staring at the ceiling. There was nothing up there. That was the point. If I looked at the ceiling long enough, I could pretend I was somewhere else. Lying in a field in the Highlands, maybe. I'd done that once, as a boy. Before the scholarships and the recruitment and the slow, methodical flaying of every soft thing inside me. Lain in the grass outside Inverness and stared up at a sky so vast it made him feel like nothing, and the nothing had felt like freedom. Now the nothing felt like an ending. You knew the cost, Crane said. His voice was mild, conversational, as if we were discussing a minor scheduling conflict over tea. You were briefed on the protocol during your first week. You signed the acknowledgement. You understood, intellectually at least, what speaking that name would trigger. And yet, a pause, measured, surgical. And yet, here we are. Times. I closed my eyes. And there it was. The name. Not the sound of it. Not yet. I was holding on to it like a man gripping the edge of a cliff with bloodied fingers. But the shape, the weight, the way it had felt in my mouth the moment I'd spoken it, like swallowing light, like the first breath after being held underwater. It had tasted like rain and wood smoke and something older, something that lived in the marrow of language itself, in the place where words still meant what they meant before we learned to weaponize them. Her name. I'd searched for it for 3 months, burned through firewalls and encrypted archives and my own better judgment. I'd dismantled every digital wall the Covenant had built around her identity, and each wall I tore down revealed another, and another, and another, like nesting dolls made of secrets and silence. And when I'd finally found it, buried in a file so deep it was practically geological, I'd sat alone in a dark room and stared at 5 letters on a screen and understood, with the quiet clarity of a man watching a fuse burn down, that I was going to destroy myself. Not might. Would. Because I was going to speak it. I was going to say her name out loud, to her face, and I was going to watch her hear it. Watch the recognition crash through her like a wave through glass. And for that one moment, that single crystalline fraction of time, she would know she was real. That she existed. That someone had seen her. The actual her. The girl in the photograph with the long auburn hair and the wide, unguarded smile. The girl they'd erased and buried and built a weapon on top of. I was going to give that girl back to her. And then the Covenant was going to take me. Times. The procedure will take approximately 6 hours, Crane continued. He crossed one leg over the other, folded his hands on his knee. A portrait of composure. You'll experience some discomfort in the first phase. Disorientation, memory fragmentation, a period of acute emotional distress that our medical team will manage pharmacologically. By phase 2, the neural pathways associated with the target information will begin to degrade. By phase 3, you'll scrub her out of me, I said. My voice came out wrong, scraped, like something that had been dragged across gravel. I hadn't spoken in, how long? Hours? Days? The White Room existed outside of time. That was part of the design. Crane tilted his head, a bird assessing a worm. We'll remove the compromised data, yes. The name, the emotional associations attached to it. He paused delicately. Fixation. You'll retain your operational capabilities, your training, your strategic value. You'll simply be recalibrated. Recalibrated. Like a faulty instrument. Like a clock that had started keeping the wrong time. And then, Crane said, his voice dipping into something almost gentle, the gentleness of a man putting down a dog, you'll be redeployed. To find her. To neutralize the asset, yes, as per protocol. The asset. I almost laughed. Almost, but the sound died somewhere in my chest, replaced by something heavier, denser, a grief so absolute it had its own gravity. 6 hours from now, I wouldn't remember why I was grieving. 6 hours from now, I'd be the weapon they pointed at the woman I loved, and I wouldn't even know I'd loved her. I'd hunt her with the same methodical precision I'd used to find her name, and she'd look into my eyes and search for me, for Callum, for the man who'd kissed her in a safe-house bathroom with shaking hands, the man who'd stitched her wound and couldn't stop the tremor in his fingers, and she'd find nothing. A vacancy where I used to live. That was the cruelty of it, not the pain, not the erasure. The cruelty was that they'd use my body, my face, my voice, all the things she'd learned to trust, and they'd send it after her like a Trojan horse made of everything she'd ever wanted. Crane was watching me, waiting for something, a breakdown maybe, a plea, some satisfying display of regret that would validate his worldview, the worldview that said human connection was a vulnerability, and love was a malfunction, and anyone stupid enough to feel something deserved, whatever recalibration came next. I didn't give it to him. Instead, I did the only thing I had left. I said her name. Not loudly, not defiantly, I whispered it. Under my breath, beneath the hum of the electrodes, and the sterile silence of the White Room, and the weight of Crane's gaze. I whispered it like a prayer to a God I didn't believe in, like a secret told to the dark, like the last words of a man who understood that the syllables themselves were an act of war, and he was choosing to wage it anyway. 5 letters. Her whole life compressed into a sound. Crane's expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes shifted. A flicker, barely perceptible, like a crack forming in deep ice. "That won't save her," he said quietly. "No," I agreed. The electrodes hummed louder, a technician's voice somewhere beyond the white. Phase 1 commencing. I kept my eyes open. I wanted the name to be the last thing I held before they emptied me out. I wanted it etched into whatever fragment of consciousness survived the procedure, buried so deep that even their machines couldn't reach it, a seed in scorched earth, waiting. "But she'll know," I said. And I meant it. She would know. For the first time in her life, someone had spoken her name not as a weapon, not as a trigger, not as a means of control, but as an act of recognition, of witness, of the most irrational, most human, most devastating thing a person could do in a world designed to prevent it. He chose her, knowing the cost, knowing the ruin, knowing that the machine would hollow him out and fill him with purpose and point him at her throat and he would go, because he wouldn't remember not to. He chose her anyway. The current hit. White. Silence. And then, somewhere in the blinding, endless, annihilating nothing, a sound. Faint. Fragile. 3 notes of a melody he'd heard her hum in her sleep. He held on to them. He held on. Times. I'd say it again.
Thank you for listening. If you're enjoying this story and would like to experience the full novel, you can download the complete PDF version for free through the link in the description below. You'll receive the entire story in a single eBook file, perfect for reading anytime. Your support allows me to continue creating dark, immersive romances like this. And now, Chapter 1.
Chapter 1. Asset. Callum. The building didn't want to be found. That was the first thing I noticed. Not the architecture, which was Georgian, red brick, unremarkable in the way that only very expensive things can be unremarkable, but the absence of it. The way the eye slid right past it if you weren't looking carefully. Tucked between a private medical clinic and an import-export firm on a quiet street in Mayfair, the London headquarters of the Covenant occupied a space that seemed to exist in the peripheral vision of the city, always just outside the frame. No sign on the door, no brass plaque, just a matte black intercom panel with a single button and a camera lens no bigger than a pinhead. I pressed the button. 3 seconds of silence, then a click, and the door released, heavy, reinforced steel behind the period-appropriate facade. Of course, a wolf in Georgian clothing. The foyer was dim, cool, the air tasted of old stone and something faintly chemical, ozone maybe, from the electronics concealed behind the plaster walls. A woman sat behind a reception desk that could have belonged to a Harley Street dentist. Polished oak, a single orchid, a computer screen angled away from visitors. She looked up when I entered, and her smile was the most precisely calibrated expression I'd ever seen on a human face. "Mr. Reese." Not a question. "You're expected. 3rd floor, room 312. She didn't offer to show me the way. I took the stairs. Habit. Lifts were confined spaces, with one exit and a camera you couldn't control. The stairwell was narrow, white-walled, lit by motion-activated strips that flickered on 3 steps ahead of me and died 3 steps behind, so I moved through a perpetual island of light in a column of dark. Poetic, or paranoid. In my line of work, those were often the same thing. Room 312 was at the end of a carpeted corridor that smelled faintly of bergamot. The door was open. Inside, a briefing room. Rectangular table, 8 chairs, a projection screen on the far wall. No windows. The ventilation hummed at a frequency designed to be below conscious perception, but just high enough to prevent true silence, the acoustic equivalent of a low-grade headache. I cataloged these details automatically, the way other people cataloged furniture styles or paint colors. Threat assessment was the first language the Covenant had taught me. Everything else, strategy, analysis. The delicate art of predicting human behavior from incomplete data had come after. A man was already seated at the table, mid-40s, broad-shouldered, wearing a navy suit with no tie, and the particular brand of physical confidence that came from either military service or competitive rowing. His hair was cropped short, his jaw was clean, and his hands, resting flat on the table, deliberately visible, were the hands of someone who'd been trained to do damage with them. He stood when I entered. Callum Rees, a handshake, firm, exactly 2 seconds, no dominance play. Welsh? Scottish. The file said Glasgow. The file's close enough. A flicker of amusement. I'm Hargrove, Senior Operations. I'll be your primary liaison until you're integrated. He gestured to a chair. Sit. We have a lot to cover and not much time. I sat. Hargrove opened a thin dossier, physical paper, not digital, which told me more about the classification level than any stamp could, and slid it across the table. Your assignment, he said. Operative designation, 0. I opened the folder. It was almost empty. 1 page, single-sided, no photograph, no birth date, no nationality, no physical description, no next of kin, just a grid of operational statistics, mission count, success rate, deployment history, rendered in the dry, effectless language of performance metrics. She read like a spreadsheet, a column of numbers that described what she'd done but nothing about what she was. I looked up. This is it? That's what you're cleared for. I'm her handler. I need. You're her strategist, Hargrove corrected, and the distinction landed like a pin. You analyze, you plan, you coordinate deployment. You do not handle her. Nobody handles 0. That's point 1. He let that settle. Point 2, he continued, leaning back. The protocol. Something shifted in his voice. A tightening. Subtle, but there, the way a cable tautens before it snaps. 0's real identity is classified beyond anything you've encountered. Her name, her history, her origin, all of it has been sealed under a protocol that predates your clearance by a decade. You will not search for this information. You will not ask about it, and under no circumstances will you speak her true name aloud, should you ever become aware of it. I waited for the punchline. It didn't come. You're serious, I said. The protocol exists for operational security reasons that are above your classification, Hargrove said, and the words came out with the practiced cadence of something he'd recited dozens of times. Anyone who learns and verbalizes the operative's true name triggers an automatic reconditioning sequence. The process is involuntary, irreversible in its primary effects, and results in the subject being redeployed as a termination asset against the operative. The room's ventilation hummed. I parsed the sentence, reparsed it, turned it over like a stone to check what was living underneath. You're telling me, I said slowly, that if I find out her name and say it out loud, your people will, what, brainwash me into killing her? Recondition, Hargrove said, not brainwash. There's a neurological distinction. That's not the part I'm stuck on. He held my gaze, didn't blink. Sign the acknowledgement form on the last page, Mr. Rees, and then we'll go meet your operative. She was already in the room when we arrived. Briefing room 4, sublevel 2. No windows. Of course no windows. We were underground. Just concrete walls painted a color that might have been gray, or might have been the ghost of a color that had given up on itself. A metal table, 2 chairs on each side, a single overhead light that turned skin the color of parchment. She sat on the far side of the table, with her back to the wall. That was the second thing I noticed. The first was that she was not what I'd expected. The dossier had given me numbers. Cold, clean, efficient numbers. A 97% mission completion rate. 14 deployments in 36 months. Operational since age 22. The numbers had painted a picture in my mind. Someone carved from the same granite as the building. Someone whose edges were all angles, and whose eyes held the flat, professional emptiness of a person who'd made peace with being a tool. The woman in the chair didn't look like peace. She looked like a war that had been fought to a draw. Late 20s. Lean, not thin. Lean. The way a distance runner is lean. Every ounce of excess stripped away until what remained was purely functional. Her hair was dark auburn, cut brutally short, almost masculine, and it made the bones of her face stand out like architecture. High cheekbones, a narrow jaw, a mouth set in a line that wasn't hostile but wasn't welcoming either. Just closed. Like a door that had been locked so long, the key no longer existed. A scar traced a thin silver line from her left collarbone up the side of her neck, disappearing just beneath her ear. She wore a black, long-sleeved shirt, despite the warmth of the underground rooms, and I noted, automatically, the way I noted everything, that the sleeves were pulled down to her wrists, the cuffs held between her thumb and forefinger on both hands. Hiding something. Her eyes were gray, not Crane's gray. I wouldn't meet Crane for another 2 weeks, so I didn't have that comparison yet. Hers were paler, sharper, closer to silver, and they moved with a precision that had nothing to do with curiosity. When Hargrove and I entered the room, her gaze didn't go to our faces first. It went to our hands. Then, our waistlines, checking for weapons. Then the door behind us, measuring the distance, calculating the angle, assessing whether we'd blocked her exit. All of this happened in under 2 seconds. Only then did she look at my face. And dismissed me. Not rudely, not with contempt. She dismissed me. The way you dismiss a piece of furniture you've already determined isn't a threat. Her gaze moved past me, through me, returned to some middle distance that existed only for her, and I became invisible. Just another body in a room full of bodies. Just another handler, strategist, sent to manage the asset. It shouldn't have bothered me. It did. "Zero," Hargrove said. "This is Callum Reese, your new strategic coordinator. He'll be overseeing your operational planning going forward." Nothing. No nod, no acknowledgement, no change in expression. She might as well have been carved from the same concrete as the walls. "Mr. Reese, Operative 0. I pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. Hargrove remained standing near the door, deliberately, I noted, establishing that this was my meeting, my problem. "I've reviewed your operational file," I said. Silence. "Your mission history is impressive. 14 deployments, near-perfect execution rate. The Berlin extraction in particular. What do you want?" Not a question, a wall. Her voice was lower than I'd expected, with a flatness that wasn't monotone so much as deliberately emptied, like someone who'd scraped the color out of their own speech until nothing remained that could be read, interpreted, used against them. "I want to work efficiently," I said. "To do that, I need to understand how you operate. Preferences, patterns, non-negotiables, things the file doesn't cover." Something happened behind her eyes. A flicker, there and gone, fast as a camera shutter. Not surprise, exactly. More like the ghost of surprise, the memory of what it felt like to be caught off guard, surfacing for a moment before being pushed back down. "Preferences," she repeated. "Tea or coffee, insertion by air or ground, solo operations or team support, whether you debrief better in writing or in person, how much lead time you need before deployment, whether you sleep on planes." I paused. "The things that make you effective, not the things that make you useful. There's a difference." The silence that followed was a different species from the one before. Heavier, loaded. She was looking at me now. Actually looking, not through me, but at me, and the intensity of it was like stepping into a searchlight. I felt exposed in a way that had nothing to do with physical vulnerability and everything to do with the sudden, uncomfortable sense that she was reading me the way I read threat assessments. Layer by layer, assumption by assumption, down to the raw data beneath. "Coffee," she said. One word, dropped into the silence like a stone into water. "Black," she added, after a pause that lasted exactly long enough to feel deliberate. "And I don't sleep on planes." Behind me, I heard Hargrove shift his weight. He hadn't expected her to answer. Neither had I. The briefing lasted 40 minutes. Most of it was one-sided. I talked. She listened, or appeared to listen, which in operational terms was close enough. I outlined the framework for our working relationship. Communication protocols, reporting cadence, the chain of command that connected her to Crane, through me through Hargrove, through a series of cutouts and dead drops that existed to ensure no single point of failure could compromise the structure. She didn't ask questions. She didn't take notes. She sat with her hands flat on the metal table, wrists down, sleeves pulled taut, and watched me with those silver eyes. And I had the unshakable feeling that she was committing everything to memory with a fidelity that would shame a recording device. Twice, she almost smiled, not at anything I said, at the way I said it. I was being careful, too careful probably, choosing my words with the surgical precision of a man who knows he's being evaluated. And she saw through it the way you see through clean glass. Something at the corner of her mouth would twitch, barely, a micro movement that anyone else would have missed, and I'd feel the absurd, inappropriate urge to make her do it again. Dangerous thought. I filed it away and kept talking. It was near the end of the briefing, while I was demonstrating something on the projection screen, a map overlay of her next potential deployment zone, that the coffee mug happened. My mug. I'd brought it in from the corridor kitchen. Black coffee, no sugar, because I'd been awake since 4 a.m. on a red-eye from Edinburgh, and the caffeine was the only thing keeping my sentences grammatically intact. I'd set it on the edge of the table, too close to the edge. My fault, careless, and when I turned to gesture at the screen, my elbow caught the rim. The mug went over. It didn't shatter. Concrete floor. Ceramic mug. It should have. But it hit at an angle and bounced, spinning across the floor with a dull, percussive clatter, coffee spraying in a dark arc across the gray. The sound wasn't loud. But she flinched. Not at the noise. I watched it happen in real time, and the sequence was wrong for a startled response. Her eyes didn't snap toward the sound. They squeezed shut, a fraction of a second, a blink that lasted one beat too long, and her hands on the table went rigid, fingers pressing into the metal surface as if she were bracing against something, and then it was over. Control reasserted itself. The mask slid back into place like a visor being lowered. But I'd seen it. She hadn't flinched at the sound. She'd flinched at the breaking, at the expectation of something shattering, which meant that somewhere in the sealed, classified, untouchable history that the Covenant had locked away behind protocols and neural triggers and layers of encryption, somewhere in the life of the girl who'd existed before Zero, things had broken, loudly, violently, often enough that her body still braced for it, years later, even when her mind had been trained not to. I picked up the mug. It had survived. A crack ran down one side, leaking coffee in a thin, dark line, but the structural integrity held. "Sorry," I said. Kept my voice neutral. Didn't look at her directly, because I understood, instinctively, that acknowledging what I'd just seen would be a violation she wouldn't forgive. Jet lag. I'm not usually this clumsy. She said nothing. But her hands on the table relaxed, incrementally, one finger at a time. Hargrove walked her out. I stayed in the briefing room, standing over the coffee stain on the floor, holding a cracked mug and thinking about a flinch that had lasted less than a second and told me more than her entire operational file. I should have left it alone. That's what a good strategist would have done. Noted the information, filed it under psychological profile incomplete, and moved on. She was an asset. I was a coordinator. The space between us was supposed to be professional, clinical, populated exclusively by mission briefs and extraction timelines and the cold arithmetic of risk assessment. I should have left it alone. But I kept seeing her hands on the table, the way the sleeves were pulled down, held in place by her thumbs. The deliberateness of it. Not casual, ritual. The kind of gesture that had been repeated so many times it had become architecture, part of the body's structural vocabulary, as unconscious and necessary as breathing. Hiding something. And then, when she'd stood to leave, when Hargrove had opened the door and she'd turned to pass through it, when, for one unguarded heartbeat, her left hand had released its grip on the sleeve and the fabric had ridden up her wrist, I'd seen it. Not a scar, not a bruise, not the track marks that my training had taught me to look for. Letters. Faded, blurred, half obliterated by what looked like multiple rounds of laser removal, but still there, persistent as a ghost that refused to be exorcised. Ink that had been forced into skin and then systematically burned out, layer by painful layer, until all that remained was a shadow, a palimpsest, a name. Her name. She'd tattooed it on her own wrist, and then someone, or she herself, and somehow that possibility was worse, had tried to erase it. I stood in that empty briefing room for a long time after she was gone. The coffee dried on the concrete floor. The fluorescent light buzzed its subliminal buzz. The ventilation hummed at its frequency just below conscious thought. And I made the first mistake. Not the big one. Not the one that would come months later, in a rain-soaked alley, with her screaming at me not to say it. That was the final mistake, the culmination, the last domino in a long, deliberate, self-destructive chain. This was the first. Small, quiet. The kind of mistake that doesn't feel like a mistake when you're making it. The kind that feels, instead, like a door opening. Like the beginning of something that hasn't yet revealed whether it's a rescue or a ruin. I went back to my assigned office on the 4th floor. I sat down at the encrypted terminal. I opened the internal network, the one I'd been given access to 6 hours ago, the one that contained everything the Covenant wanted me to see and nothing it didn't. And I started looking for her. Not the operative, not Zero, not the column of mission statistics and deployment data and the clean, efficient numbers that described what she'd done. The girl, the one who'd flinched at a breaking mug. The one who'd tattooed her own name on her wrist so she wouldn't forget it. The one who drank her coffee black and didn't sleep on planes and had almost, just barely, in the space between one breath and the next, smiled. I told myself it was professional curiosity, due diligence. A good strategist understood his operative at every level, and the psychological profile I'd been given had gaps you could drive a convoy through. I told myself a lot of things in those early days. None of them were true. The truth was simpler and worse. I wanted to know her name. Chapter 2. Perimeter. 0. I didn't dream. That was the official line, the one I gave the psych evaluators every 6 months, when they sat me down in their pale green offices and asked their pale green questions with the particular brand of clinical empathy that came from postgraduate training, and a complete inability to imagine the things they were asking about. Do you experience nightmares? 0. No. Intrusive memories? Flashbacks? No. And your sleep quality? On a scale of 1 to 10? 7. Always 7. Not so high that it sounded performative, not so low that it triggered a flag. 7 was the number that said, functional, stable, not worth investigating further. I'd learned to speak fluent normal a long time ago. It was its own kind of camouflage, the most effective one the Covenant had ever given me. The truth was more complicated. I didn't dream because I didn't sleep deeply enough to dream. I existed in a shallow, watchful state that mimicked rest, eyes closed, breathing regulated, body still, while some part of me remained switched on, scanning for sounds, calculating distances, tracking the position of the knife I kept under my pillow the way other people kept their phones. If you'd hooked me up to a monitor, the readings would have shown a brain that never fully descended into REM, a mind treading water in the shallows, never diving. I didn't find this remarkable. It was simply the architecture of survival. The body adapts. The mind rewires. You become the thing that keeps you alive. And if that thing is a woman who sleeps like a sentry, then that's what you are. 0. I got up at 4:47. Not because an alarm went off. I didn't use alarms. The sound of them triggered something in my chest that I'd stopped trying to name, but because 4:47 was when my body decided, every morning, with the mechanical precision of a clock that had been wound once and never stopped, that it was time. The quarters the Covenant assigned me were functional. A room on sublevel 3 of the London facility, 8 by 12 feet, windowless, containing a single bed, a wardrobe, a desk, and a bathroom with a shower stall barely wide enough to turn around in. The walls were the same institutional gray as the briefing rooms. There was no mirror. I'd removed it myself 3 years ago. Not dramatically, not in a fit of dissociative crisis, or a cinematic breakdown. I'd simply unscrewed it from the wall one Tuesday morning and placed it face down in the wardrobe, and when facilities management had sent someone to reinstall it, I'd told them it was causing a glare that disrupted my sleep. They'd noted it in my file and moved on. Nobody argued with Zero about her living conditions. There were advantages to being the operative everyone was slightly afraid of. The real reason was simpler. I didn't want to see my face. Not because I hated it, not because it triggered some dramatic cascade of trauma and self-loathing, but because my face belonged to someone I no longer was, someone whose name I couldn't remember, whose history had been filed away behind protocols and classifications, whose entire existence had been compressed into a single line in a sealed dossier. Looking at my reflection meant confronting the gap between the girl who'd once lived behind those eyes and the instrument that occupied the space now. The girl was a ghost. The instrument was a fact. And the mirror insisted every time on showing me both. So I'd removed the mirror. Problem solved. I showered in water cold enough to hurt. Dressed in black. Always black. Because color was a choice, and choices implied a self. And I had streamlined the concept of selfhood down to its barest operational minimum. Pulled the sleeves of my shirt to my wrists, held the cuffs between my thumbs and forefingers. Checked. The tattoo was still there. Always still there. No matter how many sessions, how many lasers, how many hours of controlled burning that had left the skin raw and weeping and new. The ink had been driven too deep. Cheap tattoo. Kitchen job. Done by a girl who'd known she was about to lose everything, and had wanted to save at least this, at least her name, at least proof that she'd existed before they turned her into a function. I couldn't read it anymore. The letters were ghosts of letters, shadows dissolved into scar tissue, illegible to anyone who didn't already know what they said. I didn't know what they said. That was the part that should have been unbearable, the part that, in a different life, in a different woman, might have been the thing that finally cracked the glass. I'd carved my own name into my own skin, and I couldn't read it. The Covenant's reconditioning hadn't just sealed the file. It had sealed me. The name existed somewhere in the deep architecture of my brain, locked behind doors I didn't have keys for, and every morning I looked at the ruined tattoo and felt the absence of it like a missing tooth, a space where something fundamental should have been. I pulled the sleeve down, checked the cuffs, moved on. The new strategist was a problem. Not in the ways I'd anticipated. I'd had handlers before, coordinators, liaisons, whatever title. The Covenant was using that quarter to make the leash sound like a partnership. They came in two varieties, the ones who were afraid of me and compensated with rigid formality, and the ones who weren't afraid of me and compensated with aggressive authority. Both types were manageable. Both types kept their distance, which was the only thing I required from the arrangement. Callum Reese was neither. He'd been assigned to me for 11 days, and in that time he had quietly, methodically, without any apparent awareness that he was doing it, begun dismantling the architecture of my isolation. It started with the coffee. Day 2, he'd appeared at the briefing room with 2 cups, his and mine, black, no sugar. He hadn't asked if I wanted it. He'd simply remembered what I'd said in our first meeting, a single word, offered reluctantly, barely a concession, and had converted it into an action without making a production of it. No announcement, no performative thoughtfulness. Just a cup, placed at my end of the table, 3 inches from my right hand, exactly where I could reach it without adjusting my position. I'd stared at it for 9 seconds before picking it up. He'd pretended not to notice. Day 4. He'd ask whether I preferred to review operational briefs in hard copy or on screen. I'd said hard copy, because screens could be monitored remotely, and hard copy could be controlled, and the next morning there was a printed dossier waiting on the table beside the coffee, bound with a black clip, the pages oriented for left-handed reading. I was left-handed. He'd noticed. Day 7. During a planning session for a potential extraction in Vienna, he'd disagreed with my proposed entry route. Not aggressively. Not the way previous handlers had, with the barely concealed condescension of men who believed that operational authority was their prerogative, and my role was to execute, not strategize. He'd simply laid out his alternative, acknowledged the strengths of mine, and asked which one I thought would get me home alive. Get me home alive. Not complete the mission, not achieve the objective. Get me home. As if I had a home. As if home was a concept that applied to a woman who slept in a windowless box underground and didn't own a single object she'd chosen for herself. As if I mattered beyond my operational value. That was the problem, not the coffee, not the hard copies, not the left-handed orientation of the pages, or the quiet, steady way he listened when I spoke, as if my words were data worth collecting rather than noise to be endured. The problem was the cumulative weight of these small, deliberate, devastatingly human gestures, each one so minor it could be dismissed individually and so precise in aggregate that they formed a pattern I recognized with the cold clarity of a woman who'd been trained to identify threats. He was seeing me. Not zero, not the asset, the operative, the column of performance metrics in a classified file. Me. And I didn't know what to do with that. Edinburgh came on day 14. A surveillance operation. Low risk, long duration. 72 hours monitoring a suspected arms broker operating out of a converted warehouse in Leith. The kind of assignment that required patience more than skill, which was probably why Crane had approved it as Callum's first joint deployment. A test run. Training wheels for the new strategist. The safe house was a one-bedroom flat above a chip shop on a side street off Easter Road. The kind of place the Covenant kept on rotation. Rented under a shell company, furnished with the bare minimum, stocked with non-perishable food, and enough surveillance equipment to outfit a small intelligence agency. The windows faced the target building. The walls smelled like old cooking oil and damp plaster. One bedroom. One bed. I saw the calculation happen behind Callum's eyes when we walked in. The quick sweep of the space, the same threat assessment reflex I'd watched him perform in every new environment, followed by the slower, more human realization of what the logistics meant. He didn't comment on it. "I'll take the sofa," he said, setting his bag down by the kitchen counter. The sofa was a two-seater, sagging in the middle, upholstered in a fabric that had once been green and was now the color of resignation. He was 6'2". The maths didn't work. "You won't fit," I said. "I've slept in worse." "When?" A pause. He glanced at me, and something shifted in his expression. Not quite surprise, but a recalibration. I didn't ask personal questions. I didn't ask any questions. This was new territory, and we both knew it. "Kabul," he said. 2019, a drainage ditch outside Bagram for 3 nights during a comms blackout. The ditch was 18 inches wide and smelled like something had died in it, probably because something had. I didn't smile. But something happened in my chest. A loosening, faint, like a knot that had been tied so long the rope had forgotten it could be anything else. "Take the bed," he said again. "I'll be on watch for the first shift anyway." I didn't argue. Not because the bed mattered. I'd sleep the same way I always slept. Shallow, watchful, knife within reach. But arguing meant prolonging the conversation. And the conversation was doing something to me that I didn't have language for. A warming. An erosion. Like standing too close to a fire you'd been told was decorative and discovering, too late, that it produced actual heat. The first night passed without incident. The second night was when things shifted. I was on the bed, not sleeping, existing in that shallow sentinel state, eyes closed, breathing measured. Callum was in the main room, monitoring the feeds from the surveillance cameras we'd placed in the stairwell and alley behind the target building. Through the thin wall, I could hear the faint click of his keyboard, the occasional creak of the sofa as he shifted his weight, the soft rasp of his breathing. I was tracking his breathing. I hadn't meant to. It had happened the way his coffee had happened, the way the left-handed briefing pages had happened, gradually, without conscious decision, as if my operational awareness had decided, independently of my will, that Callum Rees was data worth monitoring. His breathing pattern was regular, 12 cycles per minute, steady depth, no interruptions, a man at rest, alert but not anxious. And then, sometime around 2 o'clock, the pattern changed. The rate dropped, the depth increased, the creak of the sofa stopped. He was asleep. I opened my eyes in the dark. Lay there, listening. His breathing was different in sleep. Slower, obviously, but also looser, less controlled. The discipline that governed his waking hours fell away, and what remained was something unguarded and strangely vulnerable, the sound of a man who had, for a few unconscious minutes, stopped monitoring himself. I should have closed my eyes, should have returned to my own shallow non-sleep and waited for the morning and the mission and the safe return to operational distance. Instead, I got up. I moved through the flat in the dark, barefoot, silent, the way I moved through every space, as if sound were a weakness and my footsteps were confessions. The bedroom door was open. The main room was lit only by the blue glow of the surveillance monitors, casting everything in cold, aquatic light. He was asleep on the sofa, one arm hung off the edge, knuckles brushing the carpet. His head was tilted back at an angle that would punish his neck by morning. The laptop was balanced on the armrest, screen still active, feeds cycling through their automatic rotation. I should have woken him, taken over the shift. That was protocol. I didn't. I stood in the doorway and looked at him the way I hadn't let myself look at anyone in years. Not with operational assessment, not with threat calculation, but with something older. Something that predated the training and the reconditioning and the systematic dismantling of the person I'd been before. I looked at the shadow his eyelashes cast on his cheekbones, at the stubble along his jaw, darker than the hair on his head, at the small scar on his lower lip, barely visible, shaped like a crescent moon, at his hands, large, capable, scarred across the knuckles, the hands of a man who'd punched things he shouldn't have and hadn't learned to stop. And I felt it. Not desire. Not yet. Something more dangerous than desire. Something that lived beneath it and fed it and gave it teeth. Recognition. The bone-deep, irrational, terrifying sense that this man, this specific, particular, sleeping man with his crooked neck and his crescent scar and his habit of remembering how I took my coffee, was not a handler, not a colleague, not an obstacle or an asset or a threat. He was a door. And behind the door was everything I'd been trained to forget I wanted. I stood there too long. I knew I stood there too long, because when I turned to go back to the bedroom, my bare foot caught the edge of a floorboard and it creaked. A tiny sound, barely a whisper, and his breathing changed. Not fully awake, but surfacing, a shift in rhythm, a half-drawn breath. I froze. And then, in the blue glow of the surveillance screens, with his eyes still closed and his body still loose with sleep, Callum Rees murmured a single word. Stay. He said it the way people say things in the borderland between sleeping and waking, without thought, without filter, without the careful architecture of intention. A raw, unprocessed syllable. A reflex. I didn't stay. I went back to the bedroom and closed the door and lay on the bed with my knife under the pillow and my heart doing something it hadn't done in years. Racing. Not from fear, not from adrenaline, from something I didn't have a name for, which was appropriate, because I didn't have a name for myself either. I pressed my thumb against the ruined tattoo on my wrist, and for the first time in longer than I could calculate, I hummed. 3 notes. Just 3. A fragment of something. A melody. A lullaby. A ghost of a sound that lived in a part of my memory the Covenant's machines hadn't reached. I didn't know what it was. I didn't know where it came from, but it rose out of me the way breath rises, involuntary, necessary, as old as whatever I'd been before I was this. I hummed it once. Then I stopped, pulled the sleeve down, checked the cuffs, closed my eyes. On the third morning, I woke to the smell of coffee and the sound of Callum swearing under his breath. He was at the kitchen counter, wrestling with the ancient stovetop percolator the Covenant had provided. His hair was disheveled, his shirt was wrinkled, and there were dark circles under his eyes that told me he hadn't gone back to sleep after. I didn't finish the thought. "This thing," he said, gesturing at the percolator with the kind of personal affront usually reserved for mortal enemies, "is a war crime." "The gasket's inverted," I said from the doorway. He looked at me, then at the percolator, then back at me. "How do you know that?" I didn't answer. I crossed the kitchen, took the percolator from his hands, our fingers touching for a fraction of a second, a contact so brief it wouldn't have registered, except that it did, a bright, small shock like static electricity, and disassembled it in 4 efficient movements. Flipped the gasket, reassembled, set it on the burner. 2 minutes, I said. He was watching me. That way he watched. Not like the psych evaluators, who watched to categorize. Not like Crane, who watched to control. Callum watched the way people watch things they're trying to understand, with patience, with attention, with the quiet, focused intensity of a man who believed that if he looked carefully enough, he'd see something no one else had. It was unbearable. It was the only thing that had felt real in years. "You hum in your sleep," he said. The air in the kitchen changed. "What?" "Last night, around 2, 3 notes, the same 3 notes. You hum them and then stop." He said it matter-of-factly, the way he said everything, without drama, without the performative revelation that another person might have employed. Just data. Just an observation offered the way he offered coffee, without conditions. "You probably don't know you're doing it." I didn't move. I couldn't. Because he was right. I hadn't known. I'd hummed it deliberately, yes, lying in the dark with my thumb pressed against the ghost of my own name. But the fact that it had continued, that it had leaked out of me and into the shared air of this cramped, oil-smelling flat, that he'd heard it, that meant something had escaped. Something the Covenant hadn't sealed. Something that lived below the reconditioning, below the protocols, below the layers of operational architecture that had been built on top of the girl I'd been. A sound. 3 notes. A thread leading back to a room I couldn't see, attached to a person I couldn't remember, carrying a name I couldn't read on my own skin. And he'd heard it. "Don't," I said. My voice came out harder than I intended, a blade where I'd meant a wall. He didn't flinch. "Don't what?" "Don't. Don't notice me. Don't see me. Don't stand in this kitchen with your crooked sleep and your careful questions and your impossible, infuriating habit of treating me like a person. Because people have names, and I don't, and if you keep looking at me like that, I'm going to start wanting one again, and wanting is the most dangerous thing I can do." "Don't read into it," I said. "It's just a reflex. Doesn't mean anything." He held my gaze for 3 seconds, 4, 5. Then he nodded. "Okay," he said. He didn't believe me. I didn't believe me either. The percolator hissed. Coffee rose. The morning continued. And that night, back in London, when the surveillance was packed up and the reports were filed, and I was alone again in my windowless room on sublevel 3, with the mirror face down in the wardrobe and the knife under the pillow, I opened my encrypted terminal and checked the internal access logs. I checked them every night, a habit, a perimeter, and there it was. A query, time-stamped 23:14 on the night I'd stood in the doorway watching him sleep. A search, initiated from Callum Reese's assigned terminal, targeting Covenant archival systems at a classification level 2 tiers above his clearance. Search term origin 0. He was looking for me. Not the operative, not the asset. Me. I stared at the log entry for a long time. Then I did something I couldn't explain, something that violated every protocol I'd internalized, every survival instinct I'd honed, every cold, rational calculation that had kept me alive and anonymous and safe for 6 years inside the machine that had unmade me. I didn't report it. Chapter 3. Cracks. Callum. Glasgow smelled like rain and old stone, and the particular brand of deep-fried nostalgia that hits you in the chest when you haven't been home in 7 years. I hadn't planned on coming back. Glasgow was a file I'd closed, deliberately, surgically, the way I closed all files that contained versions of myself I'd outgrown. The tenement flat in Maryhill, where my mother had drunk herself transparent. The school in Partick, where I'd learned that intelligence was a kind of violence, if you aimed it correctly. The recruitment office in the city center, where a man in a good suit had sat across from me when I was 19 and said, with the calm assurance of someone offering a lifeboat to a drowning man, that the Covenant could use someone with my particular abilities. I'd taken the lifeboat. And now, 11 years later, I was back. Not as the boy who'd left, but as someone else entirely. Someone who wore better suits and carried better secrets, and had spent the past 3 weeks dismantling encrypted files at 3 a.m. because a woman with silver eyes had flinched at a breaking mug, and he couldn't stop thinking about it. The assignment was a handoff. Intelligence suggested that a Covenant-adjacent arms network was using a charity gala at the Kelvin Grove Art Gallery as cover for a document exchange. Our job was to attend, identify the parties, photograph the exchange, and extract without engagement. Clean. Simple. The kind of operation that required social camouflage more than combat training. Which was why Zero and I were posing as a couple. I learned this 48 hours before the event, when Hargrove slid the cover identities across the table during a briefing at the London facility. 2 names. 2 legends. 1 shared hotel room at the Blytheswood Square Hotel, because married couples on a charity weekend didn't book separate rooms, and the operation required 72 hours of unbroken cover. You're David and Catherine Langley, Hargrove said. Private wealth management, Edinburgh-based, philanthropically inclined. You've been married for 3 years. He said it as if he were reading a weather report. I looked at Zero. She was sitting across the table in her usual position, back to the wall, sleeves pulled to her wrists, face arranged in the particular expression of studied blankness that I'd come to understand was not an absence of emotion but a fortress built over it. She didn't look at me. Fine, she said. 1 word, flat, final. But I'd been watching her for 3 weeks. I'd catalogued every micro-expression, every half-suppressed shift in her posture, every fleeting disruption in the careful stillness she wore like armor. And in the fraction of a second before she said fine, something had moved behind her eyes, fast, bright, immediately extinguished, that looked, if I was being honest with myself, which I was increasingly bad at, like fear. Not of the mission, of me, of proximity. Of 72 hours of pretending to be married to a man, she was already pretending not to notice. The Kelvin Grove was lit like a cathedral. Golden light poured from every window, spilling down the red sandstone facade and pooling on the wet pavement outside. The rain had stopped an hour before the event, leaving Glasgow scrubbed and gleaming in that particular way it had. A city that always looked its best after a storm, as if adversity were its native aesthetic. We arrived at 8. I wore a charcoal suit, not my own, Covenant issued, tailored to fit precisely, because nothing blew cover faster than a man uncomfortable in his clothes. She wore a dress. I hadn't been prepared for the dress. It was simple. Black, long-sleeved. Of course long-sleeved. with a high neckline that covered the scar on her collarbone and a cut that followed the line of her body without clinging to it. Understated. The kind of dress that a wealthy Edinburgh wife might wear to a charity event. Elegant, conservative, forgettable. It wasn't forgettable. Or maybe the dress was forgettable, and she wasn't. Maybe it was the way she held herself inside it, the controlled precision of her posture, the way she moved through the crowd with the fluid, predatory awareness of someone who had been trained to read a room's exit points before reading its faces. Or maybe it was the auburn hair, still short but styled differently tonight, swept back, exposing the line of her jaw, the architecture of her cheekbones, the scar that climbed her neck like a silver vine. She'd let the scar show. That detail landed in my chest like a fist. The scar was always covered, always. High collars, turtlenecks, the deliberate angle at which she held her head in briefings. It was one of her perimeters, a line drawn around a vulnerability, maintained with the same rigor she applied to everything. And tonight she dropped it, chosen a dress that exposed it, let the room see. I understood, with the pattern recognition instinct that the Covenant had trained into me, that this was not carelessness, this was cover. Catherine Langley had no reason to hide a scar. Catherine Langley's scars were just scars. Stories, maybe, from a skiing accident or a childhood fall, the kind of thing that made a woman interesting at a dinner party rather than dangerous in a dark room. She was hiding in plain sight, and she was extraordinary at it. "Ready?" I said, offering my arm at the entrance. She looked at my arm, then at my face. A calculation happened, rapid, precise, invisible to anyone who wasn't watching for it. Then she took it. Her hand settled into the crook of my elbow, and the contact, light, professional, exactly the amount of pressure a wife of 3 years would apply to her husband's arm, sent a current through me that was entirely, dangerously disproportionate to the gesture. We walked in. The gala was everything I'd expected. Champagne flutes and string quartets, and 100 people performing generosity in designer clothes. We circulated, smiled, made small talk with strangers whose names we'd memorized from the guest list, and whose faces we were committing to memory for the operational report. She was a different person. Not Zero. Not the silent, guarded operative who sat across from me in briefing rooms with her sleeves pulled down and her eyes scanning for threats. Catherine Langley laughed. Catherine Langley touched my arm when she spoke, leaned into my shoulder when someone told a joke, tilted her head at an angle that exposed the long line of her throat, and said things like, "My husband has terrible taste in wine, but I keep him around anyway." The performance was flawless, and it was killing me, because I couldn't tell where the cover ended and the woman began. Every touch could have been tactical. Every laugh could have been calculated. Every moment of warmth could have been a lie she was telling with her body for the benefit of a room full of strangers, and the fact that I couldn't distinguish the real from the operational meant that I'd lost my objectivity somewhere between Edinburgh and this gallery, and the loss was so complete, I couldn't even pinpoint when it had happened. It was during the third course of dinner that the mission's target made the exchange. We caught it. A slim envelope passed beneath the table between a Serbian diplomat and a man whose charity foundation was a washing machine for arms revenue. Zero's eyes tracked the movement while she laughed at something the woman beside her was saying about a yacht in Portofino. I photographed it with the pinhole camera in my cufflink. Clean, professional, done. And then, walking back through the gallery's main hall, past Rembrandt and Botticelli reproductions, lit by soft golden spots, she did something that wasn't in the operational plan. She leaned into me. Not for the cover. The room was behind us. The corridor was empty. There was no one to perform for. She leaned into me, the way a person leans into warmth on a cold night, instinctive, unconscious, gravitational, her shoulder pressed against my arm. Her head dipped, just slightly, toward my collarbone. The scent of her hair, something clean and faintly botanical, rosemary or thyme, like a garden she'd never had, reached me in a wave that I felt in my spine. 1 second. Maybe 2. Then she went rigid. I felt the tension snap through her body, like a cable pulled taut, and she straightened, and the space between us reopened, and the mask was back. Perfect, impermeable, so smooth I might have imagined the whole thing. I didn't imagine it. "Good work tonight," I said, neutral, steady, giving her the out she needed. "It's the job," she said. Her voice was even, but the hand that wasn't holding her clutch was trembling. Fine, barely visible, a vibration at the frequency of something fighting to stay contained. I saw it. I didn't mention it. That's what you do when someone is unraveling. You don't point at the cracks. You stand close enough that if the structure gives, you're there. And you wait. Margot Sinclair found me in the hotel bar at midnight. I was nursing a whiskey, Talisker, because if I was going to drink alone in Glasgow while pretending not to think about the woman asleep in the room upstairs, I was at least going to drink something from the right island. The bar was nearly empty. Piano music leaked from hidden speakers. The bartender had the practiced disinterest of a man who'd seen enough solitary drinkers to know when one wanted to be left alone. She sat down on the stool beside me without invitation. "You're Callum Reese." Not a question. She said it the way people in the Covenant said everything, as established fact, pre-verified, devoid of uncertainty. I looked at her. Late 40s, maybe older. It was hard to tell with women who'd spent decades in the field. Her face had the composed, weather-resistant quality of someone who'd been beautiful once and had traded beauty for competence without mourning the exchange. Dark hair shot through with iron gray, cut to the jaw, brown eyes that were warm on the surface and something else entirely underneath. "Margot Sinclair," I said. "Senior Operations, Eastern European Theater. You were Zero's handler before Trent, before me." A flicker of something in her expression. Surprise, maybe, that I'd done my homework. "Not handler," she corrected. "Liaison. Nobody handles her. I thought they'd have taught you that by now." They did. I'm a slow learner. She ordered a gin and tonic, waited until it arrived, took a sip that was really a breath. "You've been accessing restricted archives," she said. The whiskey in my hand didn't waver. Training. A body that had been taught to absorb shock without displaying it. I'm her strategic coordinator. Research is part of the... Don't. She set her glass down with a click that was louder than it needed to be. Don't insult me with a professional curiosity line. I used the same one 15 years ago, and it didn't convince anyone then either. The piano played something minor and melancholic. The bartender polished a glass. "You want to know who she is?" Margot said. "Not an accusation, a diagnosis." I didn't answer. I know because I wanted the same thing. 12 years ago, when I was young enough to believe that knowing someone's name was the same as saving them. She turned the gin glass in her hands, watching the light refract through the liquid. I found it. Something in my chest went very still. "You found her name." I found her name, her file, her history, all of it. And I sat with it in a room not unlike this one, and I held it in my hands, and I understood exactly what speaking it would cost. She drank, set the glass down, looked at me with those eyes that were warm on the surface and full of wreckage beneath. So I didn't speak it. The silence between us was the loudest thing in the room. "I kept my mind," she continued. Her voice had dropped, not to a whisper, but to the register people use when they're saying things they've rehearsed for years and still can't get right. "I kept my clearance, my career, my neural architecture intact. I stayed useful. I stayed safe." And I watched her, year after year, exist inside that machine without a name, without a self, without a single person on this earth who knew who she actually was. Because I'd chosen not to be that person. She picked up her glass, put it down again without drinking. There was someone before me, a field partner, young, brilliant, reckless, in the specific way that people are reckless when they're in love and too stupid to hide it. He found the name, he spoke it. What happened? 12 hours later, he tried to slit her throat while she slept. The words landed in the space between us and stayed there, heavy as stones. He didn't know why he was doing it, Margot said. The reconditioning was seamless. He didn't experience it as programming, he experienced it as conviction. He believed, with absolute certainty, that she was a threat that needed to be neutralized. His own memories had been rewritten to support the conclusion. He'd loved her, and then he'd tried to kill her, and the distance between those two states was 6 hours in a white room. I thought of the white room. I hadn't seen it yet, wouldn't see it for months, but the description settled into my mind with the weight of a prophecy, and I felt, for the first time, the shape of what I was walking toward. She stopped him, Margot said. Barely. He was faster than she expected because he knew her patterns. Her sleeping position, her response time, the angle at which she kept the knife. He knew everything about her because he'd loved her, and the reconditioning hadn't erased the knowledge. It had redirected it, turned intimacy into tactical advantage. Margot finished her gin. She killed him, she said quietly. Self-defense. And she didn't grieve, because by the time he came for her, he wasn't the man she'd known. He was a weapon wearing his face. And she was a woman who'd learned, once more, that closeness was a trap. She stood up, left a 20 on the bar. Stop digging, Callum. Not because of the protocol. Not because of Crane. Stop because what you're doing, what you think is saving her, is the exact sequence of events that has destroyed everyone who's tried it before, including her. She walked to the door, stopped. And if you can't stop, she said, without turning around, at least have the decency to be better than the rest of us were. The door closed behind her. I stared at my whiskey for a long time. I didn't stop. 3 days after Glasgow, I found the photograph. Not through the restricted archives. Margot's warning had made me more cautious, not less. A distinction I recognized as dangerous even as I made it. I'd rerouted my search through secondary systems, legacy databases that predated the Covenant's current security architecture, and still ran on protocols old enough to have cracks in them. It was painstaking, tedious work, the digital equivalent of sifting through geological layers with a toothbrush, and it consumed every hour I wasn't actively coordinating Zero's operations. And Zero was changing. I don't know if she was aware of it. The shifts were tectonic. Slow, deep, visible only if you were watching with the kind of obsessive attention I'd been watching with since the moment she'd flinched at a breaking mug. She'd started leaving the briefing room door unlocked when she knew I was coming. Small, almost meaningless, except that Zero never left doors unlocked. Zero's relationship with doors was absolute. Closed, locked, perimeter secured. The fact that I now arrived to find the door ajar, 3 inches, exactly 3 inches, as if she'd calculated the precise width that communicated accessibility without vulnerability, was seismic. She'd started asking me questions. Not personal ones. Operational. But the nature of the questions had shifted. Where before she'd accepted mission parameters without comment, she now probed them, not to challenge, but to understand the reasoning behind my decisions. Why this insertion route? Why that extraction window? Why I'd allocated additional surveillance on the eastern approach when historical data suggested the threat was from the south. She was trying to understand how I thought. And she'd started arriving early. 7 minutes, every briefing, without variation. She'd be there when I walked in, coffee already poured, 2 cups, 1 black, 1 with a splash of milk, because she'd noticed, just as I'd noticed, just as we'd both been noticing with a precision that had long since exceeded professional interest and entered territory I didn't have a map for. The photograph was buried in a decommissioned intake database from 2018. A scanned image, low resolution, tagged with a reference number that cross-linked to a personnel file I couldn't access. But the image itself had been cached in a backup server that nobody had thought to purge, sitting there like a fossil in digital amber. I opened it at 1:47 on a Wednesday morning in my 4th-floor office at the London facility. The screen was the only light in the room. Outside, the city hummed its nocturnal frequency, distant sirens, the white noise of traffic on Park Lane, the mechanical heartbeat of a metropolis that never fully slept. The photograph was of a girl, 15, maybe 16. She was standing in a garden, a real garden, not a park, somewhere domestic and small, with a stone wall behind her and what looked like wild roses climbing it. Her hair was long, dark auburn, falling past her shoulders in waves that caught the light and held it. She was smiling. Not the performance smile I'd seen at the Glasgow Gala. Not the calculated arrangement of facial muscles designed to communicate warmth without exposing vulnerability. This was a real smile, wide, unguarded, the kind that involved the whole face, the kind that only existed in people who hadn't yet learned that joy was something that could be taken from them. Her eyes were silver gray. I knew those eyes. I'd spent 3 weeks studying them across briefing room tables, reading their movements for data the way astronomers read the movements of distant stars, from a great distance, with instruments inadequate to the task, certain that what they were observing was significant, even when they couldn't yet explain why. This was her. Before the training and the reconditioning and the systematic dismantling. Before the short hair and the scar and the fortress she'd built around herself with such thoroughness that even she couldn't find the door anymore. Before zero. Just a girl in a garden, smiling at whoever held the camera, with her whole life written on her face in a language she hadn't yet learned to encrypt. Beneath the photograph, in small clinical type, 2 lines. Subject acquired. Name nullified. I stared at the screen. My hands were steady. My breathing was even. Every physical indicator of composure was in place, maintained by years of training that had taught my body to perform calm, even when the interior landscape was in flames. But something behind my sternum had come apart. Not broken, that would have been cleaner. This was slower, messier, a structural failure, load-bearing walls giving way under a weight they hadn't been built to hold. I was looking at a photograph of a girl whose smile had been surgically removed from her face, and whose name had been extracted from her own memory, and I was feeling something that defied every protocol I'd signed, every operational boundary I'd agreed to maintain, every cold and rational calculation that was supposed to govern the space between a strategist and his operative. I was feeling rage, not the hot, immediate kind, the other kind, the slow kind, the kind that builds in the foundations and doesn't announce itself until the structure above it begins to shift. Rage at the Covenant. At Crane. At a system that could take a girl from a garden and turn her into a designation, a statistic, a weapon, wrapped in a body that still flinched at breaking sounds. Because somewhere, buried so deep that even their machines couldn't reach it, the girl remembered what it felt like to be whole. I closed the file. I didn't close the feeling. I sat in the dark office for a long time, listening to the city breathe, and I understood, with the quiet, irreversible clarity of a man watching the ground shift beneath his feet, that I had crossed a line I could not uncross. I was no longer looking for information. I was looking for her name. Not to satisfy curiosity, not for operational advantage, not for any reason that could be justified in a briefing, or defended in a review, or explained to Margot Sinclair over whiskey in a hotel bar. I wanted her name because she deserved to have it. Because somewhere inside the fortress, behind the locked doors and the pulled sleeves and the silver eyes that scanned rooms for exits before they scanned them for people, there was a girl standing in a garden with wild roses and a smile that nobody had yet taught her to hide. And that girl had a name. And the name was hers. And no protocol, no reconditioning, no institution of men in charcoal suits had the right to take it from her. I wanted to give it back. I looked at the photograph one final time. Then I began searching for the encryption key to the file marked origin 0. It would take me 6 more weeks to crack it. I didn't know that yet. What I knew, sitting in that dark office at 2 a.m. with the ghost of a girl's smile burning on my retinas, was something simpler and more dangerous. I was not going to stop. Chapter 4. Point of no return. Callum. The extraction in Hamburg was supposed to be clean. 4 hours, in, acquire, out. A defecting Covenant analyst, with a head full of classified architecture, and a sudden, inconvenient desire to share it with the wrong people. Our job was retrieval, collect the analyst from a designated safe house near the Speicherstadt, before a rival agency got to him first, 0 on point. Me on overwatch from a surveillance van 2 blocks south, Hargrove coordinating remotely from London. Clean. The word had started to taste like a lie. Nothing involving 0 was clean. Not anymore. Not since Edinburgh. Not since Glasgow. Not since I'd sat in a dark office, staring at the photograph of a girl in a garden, and felt the tectonic plates of my professional objectivity shift irrevocably beneath me. Every operation now carried a secondary frequency, a hum of awareness that ran beneath the tactical calculations like a bass note, persistent and impossible to ignore. She was out there, in the field, where things could go wrong. Things went wrong. The rival agency was already in position. 3 operatives, ex-military, well-equipped, deployed in a triangulated formation around the safe house that suggested they'd had the location for at least 12 hours before we arrived. The analyst was dead when 0 breached the door, throat cut, body still warm. A message, not just a murder, "You're too late." 0 reported the situation through her comms piece. Voice flat, clinical, undisturbed. The analyst was gone. The intelligence was compromised. She recommended immediate extraction via the secondary route. I concurred. She made it 4 blocks before they found her. I heard it through the comms. Not the fight itself. 0 fought the way she did everything, in near silence, with an economy of motion that produced results rather than noise. What I heard was the aftermath. A sharp intake of breath, barely suppressed. A hiss through clenched teeth. And then her voice, altered, tighter, shallower, compressed by something that wasn't exertion. Contact. 3 hostiles. Neutralized. A pause. I'm cut. 2 words. Delivered with the same flat precision she'd used to report a change in weather. But I'd spent weeks learning to read the frequencies beneath her words, the way a seismologist reads the frequencies beneath the earth, and what I heard in that pause, in the space between I'm and cut, was pain. Real pain. The kind she couldn't fully suppress. I was out of the van before the second syllable faded. This was not protocol. The strategist stayed in the van. The strategist maintained overwatch. The strategist did not abandon the surveillance position and sprint 4 blocks through rain-slicked Hamburg streets in dress shoes at 2 a.m. because his operative had reported a wound that could be anything from a scratch to a severed artery, and he couldn't. I couldn't sit there. I couldn't sit in a van and listen to her breathe and not know. I found her in an alley off Brook Torquay. She was leaning against a brick wall, left hand pressed to her right side, and the hand was dark. In the sodium glow of the distant streetlights, it took me a moment to understand that the darkness was blood. Her shirt, black, always black, was soaked from the rib cage down, and the fabric clung to her in a way that made the wound's geography visible. A lateral slash, maybe 6 inches long, running along the lower ribs. A knife. One of the 3 hostiles had gotten close enough to touch her, which meant they'd been very good or she'd been very unlucky, or both. 3 bodies lay behind her in the alley. None of them were moving. She looked at me. "You left the van," she said. Not an accusation, an observation, but her eyes, those silver eyes that I'd learned to read the way navigators read stars, were doing something I'd never seen before. They were searching my face. Not for threat assessment, not for tactical information, for something else. Something that lived in the space between operational procedure and the raw, irrational, devastatingly human question of why a man who was supposed to be monitoring surveillance feeds from the safety of a vehicle was standing in a Hamburg alley at 2 a.m. with rain on his face and terror in his chest. "You're bleeding," I said. "It's superficial." "You're bleeding through your shirt, so either your definition of superficial is different from mine or you're lying." Something moved across her face. Not a smile. The memory of one, maybe. A ghost of amusement that surfaced from whatever depth she kept such things, and flickered across her features before being pulled back under. "Safe house," she said. "There's a secondary location 3 blocks east. You can lean on me and walk, or I can carry you. Those are the options." The silence lasted 4 seconds. I counted them. Each one felt geological. She leaned on me. Her arm went around my shoulders, and my arm went around her waist, below the wound, careful, feeling the heat of her body through the soaked fabric and the tension that vibrated through her like a plucked wire. She was lighter than I'd expected. Or maybe that was the adrenaline talking, rewriting my perception of weight and distance and time, until everything except the point of contact between her body and mine became theoretical. We walked. 3 blocks through silent Hamburg streets, her blood on my shirt, her breathing against my neck, the rain picking up, fine and cold, turning the pavement to black glass. She didn't speak. Neither did I. There was nothing to say that the contact wasn't already saying. The secondary safe house was a rented flat above a Kneipe on Deichterplatz. Bare walls, basic furniture, a medical kit under the bathroom sink that contained enough supplies for field triage. I locked the door, swept the room's habit, and guided her to the bathroom. She sat on the edge of the bathtub. Under the fluorescent light, the wound looked worse. The knife had gone deep enough to part the muscle, but not deep enough to reach anything vital. She'd been lucky, if luck was the right word, for a woman who'd just killed 3 people in an alley and walked away with nothing worse than a 6-inch laceration. "I can do it myself," she said, watching me unpack the medical kit. "The angle is wrong. You'd need a mirror and a third hand. I've done it before. You don't have to do it now." That landed somewhere. I saw it. A micro-flinch, not at the physical level, but at the level of something deeper, something structural. The fortress shifted. A stone dislodged. She didn't argue again. I washed my hands, pulled on nitrile gloves from the kit, knelt on the tile floor beside the bathtub and said, as neutrally as I could manage while my pulse was doing something that bore no relation to professional detachment, "I need you to lift your shirt." The pause that followed was a landscape. I understood what I was asking. Not physically. Physically, it was simple, necessary, clinical, but the layers beneath the physical were vast and treacherous. I was asking her to remove a piece of armor, to expose skin she kept covered, to let me see her at a level of vulnerability that went beyond flesh and muscle and rib and into the territory of trust, which was, for a woman whose entire existence had been built on the premise that trust was a trap and closeness was a weapon, the most dangerous thing I could ask. She lifted her shirt. Slowly. The fabric peeled away from the wound, with a sound that made my stomach clench. Wet, adhesive, the sound of blood reluctantly releasing its grip on cotton. She held the shirt bunched beneath her breasts, one hand pressed flat against her sternum, and she looked at the wall. Not at me. At the wall, a fixed point, an anchor. The wound was clean-edged, professional. Whoever had done this had known their way around a blade. I irrigated it with saline, and she didn't make a sound. I debrided the edges, and she didn't make a sound. I threaded the curved needle with 3-0 nylon suture, and she didn't make a sound. My hands were shaking. Not from the procedure. I'd stitched wounds before, in the field, in training, in a drainage ditch outside Kabul with rain in my eyes and no anesthetic. My hands were steady instruments. They did not shake. They were shaking now. Because her skin was warm beneath my fingertips. Because the curve of her rib cage rose and fell with each controlled breath, and I could feel the effort it took her to keep those breaths measured, to maintain the architecture of composure, while a man she was trying not to trust sewed her back together on the floor of a Hamburg bathroom. Because the fluorescent light picked out details I'd never been close enough to see, the faint scatter of freckles across her ribs, almost invisible against the pale skin. A second scar, older, thinner, running parallel to her spine. The way the muscles of her abdomen contracted involuntarily with each pass of the needle, a reflex she couldn't suppress no matter how perfectly she controlled everything else. I was 2/3 through the suture line when she grabbed my wrist. Not violently, not defensively. She reached down and wrapped her fingers around my wrist, my right wrist, the one holding the needle, and held it. Firm, steady. Her hand was smaller than mine, and still slick with her own blood, and the grip was not a request for me to stop. It was a stabilization. She'd felt the tremor in my hand, and she was holding me still. She was steadying me. The woman with 6 inches of open wound along her ribs was steadying the man stitching her together because she'd noticed that his hands were shaking, and she'd decided, in the middle of her own pain, in the middle of her own vulnerability, that his composure mattered more. I looked up. She was looking at me. Not at the wall, at me. And the expression on her face was not the mask, not the fortress, not zero. It was something I'd never seen. Raw, unguarded, as exposed as the wound I was stitching, as if the act of being cared for had cracked her open in a way that violence never had. "You're compromised," she said. Her voice was barely audible. A whisper that wasn't a whisper, a confession that was also an accusation, a warning that was also a plea. I didn't deny it. I couldn't. Because she was right. I was compromised. Totally. Structurally. At every level that mattered. Not by the mission. Not by the intelligence failure. Not by the 3 dead men in a Hamburg alley. By her. By the curve of her ribs under my fingertips. By the blood on her hand on my wrist. By the freckles and the scars and the silver eyes that were, for the first time since I'd known her, undefended. "Finish it," she said. I finished the suture, tied the final knot, cut the thread, applied the dressing with hands that had stopped shaking because she was still holding my wrist, and the contact had become a circuit, her pulse against mine, steady and synchronized, as if our bodies had decided, independently of our minds, that they belonged to the same system. I removed the gloves. She released my wrist, and the air in the bathroom became something else, heavier, charged, compressed to a density that made breathing feel like an act of will. We were very close. Close enough that I could see the individual variations of gray in her irises. Close enough that her breath landed on my jaw. Close enough that the distance between us was not a distance anymore, but a decision. She kissed me. Or I kissed her. Or we collided, which was closer to the truth. A convergence, mutual and simultaneous, as if the space between us had been sustaining a pressure that could no longer be contained. Her mouth found mine, and it was not tender. It was desperate, bruising, a thing made of fury and hunger and the accumulated weight of every moment we'd spent pretending we didn't want this. The coffee and the briefing pages and the unlocked doors and the 3 notes hummed in the dark and the way she'd leaned into me in a Glasgow corridor and gone rigid with the effort of pulling herself back. All of it released at once. Her hand came up to the back of my neck. My hand braced against the bathtub's edge, then moved to her jaw, her cheekbone, the short hair at her temple. She tasted like adrenaline and iron and something underneath that was just her, some irreducible essence that existed beneath the blood and the training and the operational architecture, and I drank it in with the desperation of a man who understood that this was borrowed time, that the universe in which Callum Reese kissed Operative Zero in a Hamburg bathroom was a universe that could not hold. She pushed me away, both hands on my chest, a shove that wasn't violent but wasn't gentle either. The force of a woman reasserting a boundary that she'd needed to feel dissolve before she could rebuild it. I let her. I sat back on the tile floor. She sat on the edge of the bathtub. The fluorescent light hummed. The rain hit the window. Neither of us pretended it hadn't happened. Neither of us spoke. The silence was a living thing, breathing between us, full of everything we just admitted with our bodies and couldn't yet admit with our voices. After a long time, she pulled her shirt down over the fresh bandage, stood, walked to the bathroom door, paused. "Don't," she said. The same word she'd used in Edinburgh, in the kitchen, with the percolator and the 3 notes. But the weight of it had changed. It was heavier now. Soaked through with something that sounded, if I was reading her correctly, and God help me, I was always reading her, like grief. She left. I stayed on the bathroom floor with her blood on my shirt and her taste on my mouth, and the absolute, crystalline certainty that nothing in my life would ever be the same. 0. I locked myself in the bedroom of the safe house and pressed my back against the door and did not cry. I didn't cry because I didn't know how. Not metaphorically. The mechanism was gone. It had been stripped out during the reconditioning, or maybe before. Maybe I'd taught myself not to cry long before the covenant got hold of me, back in whatever life I'd lived before this one, the life of the girl in the garden with the long hair and the unguarded smile. Maybe crying was a luxury I'd abandoned so early that the neural pathway had atrophied, and now, when the pressure behind my eyes built to a level that should have produced tears, it produced nothing. Just pressure, just heat, just the maddening, airless sensation of something trying to escape a container that no longer had an exit. I could still feel his mouth on mine. I could still feel his hands, shaking, those steady, capable, scarred hands shaking as they stitched me together, as if the act of repairing my body was costing him something essential. I could still feel the moment his composure had cracked, and the thing underneath, not desire, or not only desire, but something vaster and more terrifying, had poured through the gap. He cared about me. Not about 0, not about the operative, the asset, the mission completion statistic, about me, about the woman underneath, the one I'd spent 6 years insisting didn't exist. He'd looked at me on that bathroom floor with my blood on his hands and my defenses in ruins, and he'd seen someone worth shaking for. And I'd kissed him. I'd kissed him because in that moment, with the fluorescent light and the rain and his trembling wrist held in my bloody hand, the alternative, not kissing him, maintaining the distance, preserving the architecture of my own erasure, had become physically impossible. My body had made the decision before my mind could intervene. A mutiny, an uprising from whatever part of me still remembered what it was to want something. It was the most dangerous thing I'd done in 6 years. More dangerous than the 3 men in the alley. More dangerous than every extraction, every infiltration, every mission that had put my body in the proximity of violence. Because violence I understood. Violence I was built for. The Covenant had engineered me to survive violence the way a bridge is engineered to survive weight, structurally, fundamentally, at the level of design. They had not engineered me to survive Callum Rees. I pressed my thumb against the tattoo on my wrist and tried to remember how to breathe. Callum. I cracked the encryption 6 hours later. She was asleep in the bedroom, or performing sleep, which amounted to the same thing. I was at the safe house's encrypted terminal, running the decryption algorithm I'd been building for 6 weeks through the final layer of the Covenant's archival security. The Hamburg mission was scrubbed. Hargrove had accepted my field report without comment. We were on stand-down for 48 hours while the operational review processed. 48 hours. Enough time. The file opened at 4:23. Origin, 0. Classified, Ultra. Access restricted to director level and above. I read it. The file was comprehensive. 67 pages. It began with an intake report dated 2016 and progressed through 6 years of documentation with the meticulous, dispassionate thoroughness of an institution that understood the importance of record-keeping. Medical evaluations, psychological assessments, training benchmarks, reconditioning protocols, described in clinical language, that managed to be both precise and obscene, the bureaucratic poetry of dehumanization. And at the very beginning, on the first page, in a field labeled Subject Identification, her name. 5 letters. I stared at them. The room was dark except for the screen's glow. The rain had stopped. The flat was silent, except for the hum of the terminal's cooling fan and, from beyond the bedroom wall, the faint rhythmic sound of her breathing. I stared at the 5 letters and felt something happen to me that I lack the vocabulary to describe accurately, so I'll describe it in the language I have. It was like watching a door open. Not violently, not kicked in or blown off its hinges, slowly, the way a door opens when the person on the other side has been standing there for a long time, deciding. A gentle, irrevocable swing, and behind it, light. Not a room, not a space, just light, the undifferentiated, overwhelming luminance of a truth that has been contained too long in too small a space and is now, finally, given permission to exist. Her name was not remarkable. That was the thing. It wasn't exotic or unusual or dramatically significant. It was ordinary, the kind of name a mother chooses because it sounds like a wish, because it carries the weight of something hoped for rather than something achieved. A garden name. A lullaby name. The kind of name that belongs to a girl with long auburn hair and wild roses behind her, and a smile that hasn't yet learned to hide. I mouthed it, silently, felt the shape of it in my lips and teeth and tongue, the way the consonants gave way to the vowel, the way a held breath gives way to air. And then I read the rest of the file. And understood. The protocol, the name trigger, the reconditioning, the conversion of a loved one into an assassin, was not a punishment. It was not a deterrent. It was not a security measure designed to protect operational integrity. It was an erasure mechanism. The reconditioning did not simply turn the speaker into a weapon aimed at zero. It erased the name from their mind. Completely. Permanently. The neural pathways associated with the knowledge were not suppressed. They were destroyed. The speaker lost the name, lost the emotional associations attached to it, lost every thread that connected the word to the woman. They became a blank, a void in the shape of a person, rewritten with a single directive. Find the operative, terminate the operative, eliminate the only witness to a name that no longer existed in any living mind. The Covenant had not built the protocol to protect Zero. They had built it to ensure that no one could ever truly know her. That no matter how close someone got, no matter how many walls they scaled, how many encryptions they cracked, how many silent, devastating hours they spent learning to read the frequencies beneath her words, the act of fully knowing her would be the act of forgetting her. The circle was closed, perfect, airtight, a prison made not of walls but of a paradox. To speak her name was to lose the ability to remember it. She could never be known by anyone, ever, unless someone was willing to speak the name and lose it, unless someone valued the act of recognition, the single shattering moment in which she heard her own name and remembered that she was real, more than they valued their own mind. I closed the file, sat in the dark, listened to her breathe through the wall, and I understood, with a clarity that felt less like revelation and more like gravity, inevitable, natural, a force that had been acting on me since the moment she'd flinched at a breaking mug, what I was going to do. Not now, not yet. There were things to build first, escape routes, contingencies, a framework that would give her a chance of surviving what came after, because the protocol didn't just turn the speaker into a weapon, it activated a Covenant-wide hunt, and she would need somewhere to run. I was going to say her name. I was going to look at her and speak the 5 letters that the Covenant had buried beneath layers of encryption and reconditioning protocols and institutional machinery, and for one moment, just one, she would know who she was. The girl from the garden would surface through the operative like light through water, and she would hear herself, and she would exist, and the existence would be witnessed. And then they would take me, the white room, the electrodes, the slow, methodical unwinding of every memory and emotion and neural pathway that connected me to her. 6 hours, Crane would say. Some discomfort. A recalibration. I mouthed her name again in the dark. held it on my tongue like the last sip of something precious. And for the first time in my life, I was not afraid. Not brave, either. Beyond both. In the territory that exists past the event horizon, of a decision so absolute that fear becomes irrelevant. Not because the danger has diminished, but because the thing you're willing to be destroyed for has become more real than the destruction. Through the wall, she turned in her sleep and hummed. 3 notes. The same 3 notes. I closed my eyes and listened, and the melody wound itself around the name in my mind like ivy around a gate. And I held both, the name and the music, the word and the wound, and waited for the morning. Chapter 5. Hunger. 0. Something had changed in his eyes. Not immediately, not in Hamburg, where the aftermath of the kiss had settled over us like ash. Silent, pervasive, impossible to brush off, without acknowledging that a fire had happened. We'd flown back to London on separate transports, debriefed separately, filed separate reports that described the same operational failure in the same clinical language, and mentioned nothing about a bathroom floor, a trembling wrist, a mouth against a mouth in fluorescent light. We were professionals. We were liars. But something had shifted in Callum Reese, and I couldn't identify it until 3 days after Hamburg, during a routine briefing in room 312, when he set the coffee down at my end of the table. Black, no sugar, 3 inches from my right hand, exactly where he always placed it, and looked at me. And I understood. It wasn't desire. I knew desire. I'd been trained to recognize it in targets, in assets, in the men and women whose vulnerabilities I exploited as part of my operational toolkit. Desire had a signature, a dilation of pupils, a gravitational pull in the gaze, a frequency that the body broadcast whether the mind consented or not. I could read it the way a musician reads sheet music, automatically, structurally, without emotional engagement. This was not desire. This was recognition. He looked at me the way people look at something they've been searching for and have finally found. Not with triumph, not with possession, but with the quiet, devastating steadiness of someone who has located a truth and intends to hold it regardless of what it costs. There was knowledge behind his eyes. Not the operational knowledge of a strategist assessing his operative. Something deeper. Something personal. Something that said, without words, without gesture, without any of the thousands of microsignals I'd been trained to detect and decode. I know who you are. The coffee cooled on the table. I didn't drink it. I couldn't move. Because the thing about being unseen, about existing for 6 years as a designation, a function, a ghost inside a machine, was that invisibility became structural. It wasn't something you wore. It was something you were. The absence of a name wasn't a gap in my identity. It was my identity. I'd built an entire architecture of selfhood on the foundation of not being known, and now a man with hazel eyes and a Glasgow accent he couldn't fully suppress was looking at me with a knowledge that threatened to make the whole structure uninhabitable. If he knew me, then I existed. If I existed, then the girl in the garden was real. If the girl was real, then what had been done to her was a crime. And if it was a crime, then someone was guilty. And the guilt didn't just belong to Crane or the Covenant or the faceless institution that had filed her under subject acquired. It belonged to me too. Because I'd let them do it. I'd consented to the erasure. Not at the beginning, maybe. Not when I was 15 and frightened and had no power to refuse. But after. Every day after. Every morning I woke up and checked the cuffs and pulled the sleeves down and moved through the world as 0. I was choosing the erasure, ratifying it, maintaining the prison from the inside because the alternative, being known, being seen, being real, was so vast and terrifying that the cell felt safer. Callum's eyes said, "The cell is not safer." Callum's eyes said, "You deserve the vastness." I hated him for it. I started pushing back on day 4. Not physically. Not with the blunt, efficient violence that was my primary language. I used the other weapons. The ones that cut deeper because they were precise, because they were personal, because they targeted the specific vulnerabilities of a man who cared too much and couldn't hide it. During a planning session for a reconnaissance deployment in Lyon, I interrupted his tactical overview to say, "You're making assumptions about my extraction capabilities that aren't supported by the operational data." He paused, looked at me. "Which assumptions?" "All of them. You're overestimating my resilience window and underestimating the hostiles. Response time. If I follow your plan, I'm exposed for 90 seconds longer than necessary during the withdrawal phase." I accounted for that. The diversionary element relies on a timing precision that assumes I won't encounter complications. I always encounter complications. That's what happens when you send a single operative into a multi-threat environment without adequate support infrastructure. I let the words land, let the implications settle. You're planning for the version of me you want to exist, not the one that does. A flicker in his jaw. Not hurt. He was too controlled for that, too professionally armored. But something beneath the armor shifted. I'd hit a nerve, and I knew it, because I'd aimed for it. "What would you suggest?" he asked. Voice steady, eyes steady, everything steady, like a man standing in a strong wind and refusing to acknowledge the force of it. "A different strategist," I said. The room went very quiet. Hargrove, who was monitoring remotely through the conference speaker, said nothing. The ventilation hummed. The fluorescent lights buzzed their subliminal frequency. Callum looked at me for a long time. Then he said, "No." One word. No elaboration. No defense. No explanation of why he was refusing a request that any reasonable coordinator would at least consider. Just a flat, absolute, unadorned refusal that communicated, with a clarity I found both infuriating and devastating, that he understood exactly what I was doing and was declining to cooperate. I'd thrown him a rope and told him to hang himself, and he'd looked at the rope and looked at me and said no. I tried again. Day 6. We were in the canteen, a windowless room in the basement of the London facility, where operatives and support staff ate meals that had been engineered for nutritional efficiency rather than pleasure. Callum was eating a sandwich and reading a dossier. I sat down across from him, which was unusual. I normally ate alone, or didn't eat at all, because the canteen required a level of social performance I found exhausting. He looked up. The recognition was there, always there now, like a light he'd switched on and couldn't find the fuse for. "You have a hero complex," I said. He set down the sandwich. "Is that a clinical assessment or a personal observation?" "Both. You see a problem and you need to fix it. It's not altruism, it's compulsion. You can't tolerate broken things existing in your proximity without attempting to repair them. It makes you feel in control of a world that isn't controllable. It's a coping mechanism, not a virtue." I delivered this with the flat, affectless precision I used in operational debriefs. Cold, clinical, a scalpel, not a fist. He listened. He didn't flinch. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, with a mildness that was infinitely more dangerous than anger, "You're not a broken thing." "That's not." "You're not a thing at all. That's the part you keep getting wrong." He picked up his sandwich, returned to his dossier. Conversation over. I sat across from him with my untouched tray and my demolished arguments and the terrible, unwanted, chemically overwhelming sensation of being known by someone who refused to look away. Day 9. The corridor outside Briefing Room 4, Sublevel 2. Late evening, most of the facility was empty. Skeleton staff, security rotation, the nocturnal hum of servers and ventilation, and the building's mechanical immune system doing its quiet work. I'd stayed late. So had he. This had become a pattern. Both of us lingering in the facility after hours, orbiting the same spaces without acknowledging the gravity that kept pulling us into alignment. I'd told myself it was operational discipline, extra preparation, the dedication of a consummate professional. I was a liar. He was coming down the corridor as I was leaving. We met at the intersection, the T-junction, where Sublevel 2 split between the briefing rooms and the residential quarters. The lighting was reduced to its nighttime setting, dim amber, casting long shadows that made the concrete walls look softer than they were. He stopped. I stopped. 3 feet of corridor between us. No witnesses. No cameras. I knew the camera positions on every sublevel by heart, and this junction was a blind spot, a 45-degree angle of architectural oversight that security had never corrected, because nobody was supposed to be here at 2300 on a Tuesday. "Stop it," he said. "Stop what?" "The pushing, the tests, the clinical deconstruction of my character designed to make me withdraw. I know what you're doing, and I understand why you're doing it, and it's not going to work." His voice was low, not angry. Something beyond anger. A register that bypassed emotion entirely and spoke from a place of structural certainty, the way foundations speak, the way bedrock speaks, immovable. "You don't know anything about me," I said. "It came out wrong. I'd meant it as a wall. It came out as a wound." "You hum in your sleep," he said. 3 notes. The same 3 notes, every time. You don't know what they are, but your body does. Something in you remembers a melody that no one taught you to forget. I opened my mouth, closed it. "You flinch at breaking sounds, not loud sounds, breaking sounds specifically, glass, ceramic, things that shatter. Your startle response is calibrated to fragmentation, not volume, which means whatever happened to you before the covenant involved things being destroyed in your proximity, repeatedly, until your nervous system rewired itself to anticipate the destruction before it happened." The amber light hummed. The corridor stretched in both directions, empty, endless. "You tattooed your own name on your wrist because you knew they were going to take it. You were 15. You did it with cheap ink and a sewing needle? Probably, because you didn't have access to anything better, and you drove it deep because you wanted it to survive whatever came next. And when they tried to burn it off, the ink held. It's still there, illegible but present. You check it every morning. You hold your sleeves over it with your thumbs. It's the first thing you do when you wake up, and the last thing you do before you sleep. The pressure behind my eyes built to a level that should have produced tears. It produced nothing. You don't do those things because you're no one, Callum said. His voice had dropped further, into a register that was barely above a whisper, intimate and raw, in a way that made the empty corridor feel like a confessional. You do them because somewhere inside you, the person they tried to erase is still alive. She's humming. She's flinching. She's holding on to her own name with her thumbs. And you can tell me she doesn't exist, and you can push me away, and you can reduce me to a clinical profile and a hero complex, and whatever other language helps you maintain the fiction that you're nothing more than a function. He took a breath. But I've seen her, and I'm not going to pretend I haven't. The corridor was silent. The building breathed its mechanical breath. And something behind my eyes, not tears, something else, something older and deeper and more structural than tears, opened. Not visibly. I didn't cry. I didn't collapse. I didn't fall into his arms like a woman in a story where falling is the resolution rather than the beginning of the fall. But something opened. And it was more devastating than tears. More devastating than anything the Covenant had ever done to me. Because the Covenant had broken me open with force and machinery, and the cold, institutional violence of a system that treated personhood as a liability. Callum Rees broke me open with attention, with patience, with the unbearable, meticulous, ruthless act of paying attention to the details I'd hidden from everyone, including myself. He saw the girl. And the girl was real. And being real hurt more than I'd thought anything could. I don't know who moved first. One moment we were standing 3 feet apart in the dim amber corridor. The next, the distance was gone. Not eliminated, but dissolved, as if the air between us had simply given up its claim on the space and surrendered it to something with a stronger gravitational field. We were in my quarters. Door closed. The room was dark. No mirror to catch the light. No window to let it in. Just the faint luminescence from the corridor seeping under the door, and the blue-green glow of the terminal's standby light, painting everything in deep aquatic shadow. He was sitting on the edge of my bed. I was standing in front of him. This was nothing like Hamburg. Hamburg had been collision, desperate, bruising, two people crashing into each other because the alternative had become physically impossible. This was something else, slower, more deliberate. The speed of geological processes, of continental drift, of two tectonic plates moving toward each other at a rate too slow to perceive and too powerful to stop. "Show me," he said. Not a command, not a request, an invitation, offered with the same quiet, devastating steadiness with which he did everything. Placed coffee at the correct distance, oriented pages for left-handed reading, refused to look away when looking away would have been easier. I knew what he meant. My hands went to my left sleeve, the cuff held between thumb and forefinger, the gesture I'd performed 10,000 times, the ritual of concealment that had become as automatic and essential as breathing. I held it for a moment, felt the fabric against my skin, felt the familiar pressure of the hidden tattoo beneath it, the ghost of a name pressing up against the underside of the world, like a face pressing against glass from the other side. I let go. The sleeve fell back. I turned my wrist upward and held it out to him. He didn't reach for it immediately. He looked. In the blue-green half-light, the tattoo was barely visible, a smudge of shadow against pale skin, the remnants of letters that had been lasered and burned and scarred over, until they resembled nothing so much as a topographical map of a very small, very violent landscape. Scar tissue layered over ink, layered over skin, layered over bone, strata. Archaeology. The history of a girl who had tried to save herself with a needle and cheap ink, and had failed, and failed, and failed, and kept the evidence of the failure strapped to her wrist every day, like a bandage over a wound that refused to close. He reached out. His fingers touched my wrist. The contact was so light, it barely qualified as touch. A brush, a graze, the pressure of a moth's wing against glass. He traced the outline of the tattoo with his index finger, following the ruined letters the way a blind man follows Braille, reading something he couldn't see with a sensitivity that suggested he didn't need to see it. He already knew what it said. The realization hit me like a wall of cold water. He knew. He'd found it. The name. The file. The identity that the Covenant had sealed behind protocols and reconditioning and layers of encryption dense enough to bury a civilization. He'd searched for it and he'd found it, and he was sitting on my bed in the dark, tracing the ghost of it on my skin, and he hadn't spoken it. He hadn't spoken it. The protocol, the trigger, the reconditioning that would unmake him and point him at my throat. He was holding the most dangerous word in his vocabulary behind his teeth, and he was touching my wrist instead, and the restraint, the sheer, agonizing, impossible restraint of a man who knew a name and chose to trace it rather than speak it. I couldn't breathe. "You know," I said, not a question. His fingers stilled on my wrist, but he didn't pull away. "Yes." One word, quiet as a closing door. The room was very dark. The terminal's standby light pulsed its slow, aquatic rhythm. My pulse beat against his fingertip, and I could feel his pulse in return, transmitted through the point of contact, two rhythms in near alignment, separated by a fraction of a second that felt like the width of a canyon. "How long?" I said. 3 days. 3 days. He'd known my name for 3 days. He'd sat across from me in briefing rooms, coordinated operations, placed coffee at the correct distance from my hand, all while holding a word that could destroy him. He'd carried it the way I carried the knife under my pillow, silently, constantly, with full awareness of its capacity for damage. "You haven't said it." "No." "Why?" He looked up at me. In the dark, his eyes were more shadow than color. Deep, oceanic, the hazel swallowed by the low light, until only the intensity remained. The intensity of a man who had found the thing he'd been searching for and was now confronting the question of what finding it required of him. Because saying it once and losing it isn't enough, he said. You deserve someone who can say it and remember it, who can call you by your name every morning and mean it, not someone who whispers it once and then becomes the thing they send to kill you. The pressure behind my eyes. The heat. The airless, containerized sensation of something trying to escape through walls that had no doors. Then don't say it, I whispered. Don't ever say it. I'm not worth your mind. His finger resumed its slow tracing of the tattoo, along the first letter, the second, the ghost of the third, where the laser had been most aggressive and the scar tissue was thickest. He mapped me with a patience that felt like devotion, and the devotion felt like drowning, and the drowning felt like the first honest thing that had happened to me since a girl in a garden had smiled at a camera and meant it. That's not your decision, he said. I pulled my wrist away, not harshly. Slowly, the way you pull something fragile from a place where it's been resting, I stepped back. 1 step. The distance between us reopened. 3 feet. The same 3 feet. The same corridor width of air that had once felt like safety and now felt like a severance. He let me go. He always let me go. That was the cruelty of it. He never held on. He never pressed. He never used the knowledge he had. The name, the history, the arsenal of vulnerability I'd accidentally given him as leverage. He simply stood at the edge of the space I'd carved around myself and waited, and the waiting was more devastating than any pursuit could have been, because it was patient and it was real and it communicated, with every breath of distance he maintained, that the door was open whenever I chose to walk through it. I didn't walk through it. Not that night. I pulled the sleeve down, held the cuff between thumb and forefinger, rebuilt the perimeter. He stood, walked to the door, paused with his hand on the frame, and I almost called him back. The word was in my throat. Not his name, just the word stay. The same word he'd murmured in his sleep in Edinburgh, now forming on my lips with a weight that threatened to collapse the architecture of everything I'd built to protect myself from exactly this moment. I swallowed it. He left. The door closed, and I stood in the dark room with my sleeve pulled down and my pulse racing and the 5 letters I couldn't read burning on my wrist like a brand, and I understood, with the same cold, irreversible clarity I imagined he'd felt in his dark office 3 nights ago, that I was falling. Not in love. The word was too small, too domesticated, too tame for what was happening to me. I was falling into the possibility of being a person, into the terrifying, gravitational pull of existing as something more than a function, into the vast, uncharted territory that opened up when someone looked at you and saw not what you did but who you were. I was falling into my own name, and I didn't even know what it was. The summons came the next morning. I knew because Callum's coffee was wrong. Not the coffee itself. Black, no sugar, 3 inches from my hand, same as always. But his posture when he placed it was different. Stiffer. The muscles across his shoulders held a tension I'd learned to read the way a sailor reads wind direction, not by looking directly, but by noticing the effect on everything around it. His movements were a fraction more deliberate, his breathing a fraction more controlled, and the recognition in his eyes, the steady, devastating knowledge that had become as constant as his heartbeat, was overlaid with something new. Calculation. He was running scenarios. What happened? I said. He sat down across from me, opened the briefing dossier. His hands were steady. Of course they were. They were always steady, except when they weren't. Except when he was stitching me together on a Hamburg bathroom floor, and the steadiness failed because the woman beneath his fingers mattered more than the composure, but the steadiness now had a manufactured quality, a performance of calm. Crane wants to see me, he said. The name landed in the room like a dropped blade. Silas Crane, the director, the architect, the man who had designed the protocol that kept my name sealed behind neural triggers and reconditioning sequences. who had built the machine that had turned a girl in a garden into a designation and a function and a weapon that flinched at breaking sounds. I'd met him 3 times in 6 years. Each time, he'd looked at me with the particular warmth of a man admiring a bridge he'd engineered. Proprietary, clinical, pleased with the structural integrity. I was his masterpiece. And he was summoning Callum. When? 10 o'clock, his office, 3rd floor. I looked at the clock on the wall. 8:47. What does he know? Callum met my eyes. And in the space between one breath and the next, a communication passed between us that required no words. A fluency born of weeks of shared silence and shared coffee and shared proximity. A language written in micro-expressions and breath patterns, and the precise angle at which 2 people who are trying not to love each other hold each other's gaze. Everything. He knows everything, or enough. He's been monitoring my access logs, Callum said. The restricted archive queries. He knows I've been looking. Does he know you found it? A beat. I don't think so. Not yet. But the pattern is clear enough. He'll draw the conclusion. The coffee sat between us, untouched, cooling. The briefing room hummed its subliminal hum. Somewhere above us, 3 floors up, a man in a charcoal suit was preparing a conversation designed to assess the degree to which his newest strategist had been compromised by the operative he was supposed to manage. I wanted to tell Callum to run. The urge was violent, irrational, disproportionate, a seismic impulse that bore no relation to the controlled, calculated architecture of my operational mind. I wanted to grab him by the shoulders and shake him and say, "Leave. Now. Walk out of this building and disappear. I have extraction protocols he doesn't know about. I have identities he can't trace. I can get you out." I didn't say any of it, because telling him to run would mean admitting that I cared whether he stayed. And admitting that I cared would mean admitting that the girl in the garden was not dead, not erased, not buried beneath 6 years of reconditioning and operational architecture, but alive. Alive and humming 3 notes in the dark, and pressing her thumb against a name she couldn't read, and falling toward a man who knew her and hadn't flinched. So I said nothing, and he went. He stood at 9:52, buttoned his jacket, straightened his cuffs, a gesture I recognized, because it was mine, and seeing him perform it sent a spike of something through my sternum that felt like the structural precursor to collapse. At the door, he paused. "The Lion deployment," he said. "Your revised extraction timeline was better than mine. I've updated the operational plan to reflect your recommendations." Professional, measured, a sentence designed to communicate normalcy in case the room was monitored. But his eyes said something else. His eyes said, "I'm coming back." He left. I sat in the empty briefing room and listened to his footsteps recede down the corridor, each one measured, deliberate, the cadence of a man walking towards something he'd calculated the cost of and chosen to face anyway, and I pressed my thumb against my wrist beneath the table, and I waited. 12 minutes later, my encrypted terminal received a flagged internal notification. Director Crane had ordered the preparation of Reconditioning Suite 3. I stared at the notification, and for the first time in 6 years, I felt something that had no operational classification, no clinical designation, no place in the architecture of the weapon I'd been built to be. Fear. Not for myself. For him. Chapter 6. Collision. Callum. Crane's office smelled like bergamot and old paper. 3rd floor, East Wing, a room that had been designed, with considerable deliberation, to communicate a very specific message. I have been here longer than you, and I will be here after you are gone. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves lined 3 walls, leather-bound volumes, mostly decorative, though a few had cracked spines that suggested actual use. The desk was mahogany, vast, positioned so that the occupant sat with his back to the only window, forcing visitors to squint against the light. A powered geometry, the architecture of intimidation disguised as taste. Crane was standing when I entered. He had his back to me, facing the window, hands clasped behind him, silhouetted against the gray London morning. An echo of something I couldn't place, a posture I'd seen in photographs or paintings, or the particular visual vocabulary of men who believed their profile was a form of punctuation. He let me wait. 17 seconds. I counted. Not because the number mattered, but because counting was a containment strategy, a way of converting anxiety into data, of giving the body something to process, while the mind dealt with the man-shaped threat standing 6 feet away in a charcoal suit that cost more than my first car. "Sit down, Mr. Rice." He turned as he said it. The light caught his face. Silver hair, pale eyes, the angular bone structure of a man whose genetics had been kind, and whose temperament had not. He smiled. The smile was precise, calibrated, deployed with the same mechanical intentionality as everything else about him. It communicated warmth the way a photograph of a fireplace communicates warmth. Technically accurate, functionally useless. I sat. He took the chair behind his desk, folded his hands, regarded me with the patient, slightly amused expression of a chess player who has seen the board 6 moves ahead and is waiting for his opponent to catch up. "How are you finding the work?" he asked. Small talk. The most dangerous weapon in any intelligence operative's arsenal, because it created the illusion of safety. The sense that the conversation was a meadow, when it was actually a minefield. "Productive," I said. "The Hamburg debrief is filed. The Vienna assessment is on schedule. I've submitted revised operational parameters for the Lyon deployment based on updated threat analysis." "And the operative?" A half-beat of silence. The space between a question and its answer, where truth lives before language domesticates it. "Performing within expected parameters," I said. "Her field efficiency remains high. The Hamburg injury was superficial and hasn't impacted readiness." Crane nodded, slowly. The nod of a man who is listening to what you're saying, and simultaneously listening to what you're not saying, and finding the latter considerably more informative. "You've been accessing restricted archives," he said. No transition. No warning. The shift from pleasantry to accusation was seamless, the conversational equivalent of a blade sliding between ribs. He said it mildly, almost casually, as if he were commenting on the weather or the quality of the coffee. "Research is part of my coordination mandate," I said. "The operational files I was provided are insufficient for comprehensive strategic planning. I've been supplementing with historical data to improve deployment modeling." The lie came out clean, practiced. I'd rehearsed it in the bathroom mirror that morning, watching my own eyes for tells, calibrating the delivery until it was indistinguishable from truth. 7 years of Covenant training had given me many skills. Lying to powerful men was among the most useful. Crane watched me. The silence stretched. Not awkwardly. Crane didn't do awkward. He did deliberate. He let silences expand the way other people let arguments, giving them room to fill the space, to reveal what words were designed to conceal. "I appreciate thoroughness," he said finally. "It's a quality I selected for when I approved your transfer. Your predecessor was less meticulous." My predecessor. The one before Trent. The field partner Margot had told me about in a Glasgow hotel bar. The one who'd found the name, spoken the name, tried to slit the throat of the woman he loved while she slept. Crane was invoking him deliberately, a reminder. A warning wrapped in a compliment, wrapped in a threat, like Russian nesting dolls made of menace. "I trust you understand," Crane continued, leaning forward, "that certain classifications exist for reasons that transcend individual curiosity. The architecture of this organization is designed to protect its assets. All of them." He paused. Let the word land. "Including you. Including me." The implication was exquisite. He wasn't threatening me. He was expressing concern. He was the benevolent father, the caring director, the man who had built a system that turned intimacy into assassination, and was now, with the unshakable self-assurance of the truly monstrous, presenting that system as protection. "I understand," I said. "Good." He leaned back, The smile returned. Then I'm sure we won't need to have this conversation again. I stood, buttoned my jacket, walked to the door. Callum. I stopped, didn't turn. She's a remarkable piece of work, Crane said. His voice had shifted, softer, almost fond. The tone of a sculptor admiring his favorite creation. I'd hate to see her compromised by someone who confused professional admiration for something more personal. I turned my head. Not fully. Just enough to show him my profile, to let him see the set of my jaw and the steadiness of my gaze. So would I said. I left. In the corridor, out of the camera's sight line, I pressed my back against the wall and breathed. My hands were shaking. Not from fear. I'd moved past fear somewhere in the last 72 hours, into a territory that was colder and clearer and infinitely more dangerous. The shaking was adrenaline. The body's chemical acknowledgement that what I'd just done was not a conversation but a confrontation, and that the man on the other side of it had the power to unmake me with a phone call. He knew. Not everything, not the name, but enough. He knew I'd gone looking, and he knew what people who went looking eventually found, and he was giving me exactly enough rope to determine whether I'd use it to climb or to hang. I had days, maybe less. I started building the escape plan that afternoon. The plan required 3 things I didn't have: time, resources, and a collaborator I could trust inside the Covenant's infrastructure. Time I could manufacture. The Leon deployment was scheduled for 11 days out. 11 days of operational planning, logistics coordination, the ordinary machinery of a strategist doing his job. 11 days during which I could embed extraction protocols inside the legitimate operational framework without triggering the automated security reviews that monitored for anomalous activity. Resources I could improvise. Over 7 years, I'd built a network of contacts outside Covenant channels. Former operatives, intelligence freelancers, people who existed in the gray spaces between institutional loyalty and personal survival. I couldn't use Covenant communication systems to reach them, but I could use the Leon deployment as cover for a series of external contacts that would, on paper, appear to be standard operational networking. The collaborator was the problem. I solved it on day 3, in the least likely place, the women's restroom on sub-level 1. Margot was washing her hands when I walked in. She looked at me in the mirror, not with surprise, because Margot Sinclair hadn't been surprised by anything since approximately 2007, but with a weary resignation that told me she'd been expecting this visit since the night in the Glasgow bar. "Wrong door," she said. "No cameras in this corridor. Maintenance blind spot. You know that because you mapped the surveillance grid 12 years ago and never told anyone about the gaps." She turned off the tap, dried her hands with the deliberate slowness of a woman buying time. "What do you want, Rise? You told me to be better than the rest of you. I'm trying. I need help." She looked at me in the mirror. Her eyes were the same brown I remembered from the hotel bar, warm on the surface, devastated underneath. The eyes of a woman who had spent 15 years carrying the weight of a choice she'd been too afraid to make differently. "You found it," she said, not a question. "I found it. And you're going to speak it." "Not yet. Not until she has somewhere to go. Not until there's a framework that gives her a chance of surviving what comes after." Margot closed her eyes. Her hands gripped the edge of the sink, and for a moment, just a moment, the composure cracked, and I saw beneath it guilt. 15 years of it. A stratum of self-recrimination so deep it had become geological, part of the bedrock of who she was. She'd known a girl's name and she'd chosen silence, and the silence had calcified into a second skin that she wore every day like armor. And now a man was standing in a bathroom, asking her to help him do the thing she'd been too afraid to do herself. "You understand what you're asking," she said, opening her eyes. "Not just of me, of yourself. The reconditioning isn't a risk, Callum. It's a certainty. You speak that name, and you are done. The man you are right now, the one who cares about her, the one who's building escape routes and cornering old women in bathrooms, that man will cease to exist. And in his place, There will be something that looks like you and sounds like you, and knows every tactical weakness she has, because you spent weeks learning them. They will point you at her like a guided missile, and you will not miss. I know, and you're doing it anyway. She deserves to exist. The words hung in the tiled air of the women's restroom, incongruous, enormous, the kind of declaration that belonged in a cathedral or a courtroom or the pages of a myth, not in a fluorescent-lit bathroom on sublevel 1 of an intelligence facility in Mayfair. Margot was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "What do you need?" Not a question, a surrender. The sound of a woman who had spent 15 years waiting for someone to ask her to do the right thing, and who was discovering, in the antiseptic light of a bathroom she'd mapped for camera blind spots a decade ago, that the relief of finally being asked was greater than the fear of the consequences. Internal transport schedules, I said, the rotation cycle for perimeter security on the east egress points, Crane's calendar for the next 2 weeks. And I need you to hold a dead drop identity package at a location I'll designate outside Covenant infrastructure. For her. Passport, banking details, a clean legend that'll survive a basic inquiry. Something she can build a life on, a real one. Margot looked at herself in the mirror. I watched her study her own reflection, the way I imagined Zero studied the absence of hers, searching for something behind the glass, some version of herself that matched the person she wanted to be. "I'll have it by Friday," she said. She walked to the door, stopped. "There's something you should know," she said, "about the reconditioning. It was designed to be permanent. Total erasure of the name and associated emotional architecture. But the neurological literature on deep associative memory suggests that the process may not be absolute. Emotional imprints, the kind that form during sustained intimate contact, can survive in structures below the cortical level, the amygdala, the limbic system, areas the reconditioning protocol wasn't built to reach." I looked at her. Meaning the conditioning might not fully hold. Meaning the man who comes out of that white room might not be entirely gone. There might be fragments. Beneath the programming, muscle memory, emotional residue, the ghost of the thing, if not the thing itself. She paused. "It's theoretical. I have no evidence, but I wanted you to know that the science isn't as airtight as Crane believes it is. A crack in the architecture. A flaw in the machine. It wasn't much. A theoretical possibility offered without evidence in a bathroom by a woman whose expertise was in field operations rather than neuroscience. It was barely a thread, but I held onto it the way a man falling holds onto anything. I told her on the 9th night. Not the name, everything else. We were in the safe house. Not a Covenant safe house, but one I'd arranged independently, a rented flat in Bermondsey that existed outside the organization's surveillance grid. Getting her there had required a misdirection I wasn't proud of, a falsified maintenance alert on the sub-level residential systems that gave us both reason to be off-premises for 12 hours. Crude, but functional. The flat was small, 1 room, a kitchenette, a bathroom with a window that overlooked the railway arches. The sounds of South London leaked through the single glazed glass. Trains, distant music from a pub on the corner, the occasional siren threading through the urban noise like a bright strand in a dark weave. Normal sounds. Civilian sounds. The sounds of a world that existed outside the Covenant's hermetic architecture, where people had names and used them freely and never considered that the simple act of being known could be weaponized. She sat on the bed. I sat in the chair by the window, 3 feet between us, the same 3 feet. Our constant, our meridian, the agreed-upon distance that was simultaneously too far and too close and exactly right. I told her about the file. I told her about Origin 0, about the 67 pages, about the intake report dated 2016, the medical evaluations, the psychological assessments, the reconditioning protocols described in language so clinical it constituted its own form of violence. I told her about the girl in the photograph, the long hair, the garden, the wild roses, the smile that nobody had yet taught her to encrypt. I told her about subject acquired, name nullified. I told her about the protocol's true design, the erasure mechanism, the closed loop, speak the name, lose the name, become the weapon, the architectural certainty that she could never be fully known by anyone, that the system had been built not to protect her, but to ensure her permanent isolation, a solitary confinement made not of walls, but of paradox. I told her everything except the 5 letters. She listened. She sat on the bed in the rented flat in Bermondsey with her hands in her lap and her sleeves pulled to her wrists and her silver eyes fixed on my face, and she listened with the same absolute encompassing attention she gave to operational briefings. Except this wasn't an operational briefing. This was the history of her own destruction, narrated by a man who had broken through every security barrier the Covenant had built to keep it from her, and who was now delivering it to her the way a doctor delivers a diagnosis, with care, with precision, with the understanding that the information itself was a kind of wound. When I finished, the room was very quiet. The railway arches hummed. A train passed, close enough to rattle the window glass. The pub music drifted in, a bass line and someone's laughter, and the normalcy of it felt obscene. The world continuing its ordinary business, while a woman sat 3 feet away from me, absorbing the fact of her own erasure. She was shaking. Not the fine, controlled tremor I'd seen before, the vibration at the frequency of something fighting to stay contained. This was different, deeper, a seismic event. Her whole body was involved, from her hands in her lap, to her shoulders, to the muscles of her jaw, which were clenched so tightly I could see the tendons standing out beneath the skin of her throat. She was shaking the way the earth shakes before something gives, a deep structural disturbance that preceded either collapse or release. "Why?" she said. One word. But it wasn't the word I'd expected. I'd prepared for anger, for the cold, surgical fury of a woman whose operational mind would immediately begin calculating response strategies, threat assessments, the tactical implications of the information I'd just provided. I'd prepared for silence, the fortress slamming shut, the walls going up, the retreat into the architecture of zero that had protected her for 6 years. I hadn't prepared for this. "Why are you doing this?" she said, and her voice was the voice I'd never heard before. Not the operative's flat affect, not the briefing room monotone, not the blade-sharp deflection she used to keep the world at the distance she needed. This was underneath all of that, raw, unarchitected. The voice of the girl who'd tattooed her own name on her wrist at 15 because she'd known they were coming to take it, and she'd wanted to save something, anything, even if it was only 5 letters in cheap ink, driven deep enough to outlast the machines. "Because you deserve to exist," I said. The shaking intensified, then stopped. All at once, as if a switch had been thrown. She went still. Absolutely, completely still, with the focused immobility of a system that has just reached its load-bearing limit and is spending every available resource on not collapsing. She looked at me. And for the 3rd time since I'd known her, after Hamburg, after the corridor, and now here in this rented room above the railway arches, the mask fell away. Not partially, not the controlled, strategic exposure of a single vulnerability. All of it. The fortress, the perimeter, the architecture of absence she'd built to replace the identity they'd taken. It fell away like a curtain dropping, and behind it was not the weapon, not the ghost, not zero. Just a woman. Just a woman, sitting on a bed, shaking in the aftermath of her own stillness, looking at a man who'd torn through the walls of the most powerful intelligence organization in Europe to bring her the story of her own life. "I don't remember the garden," she said. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "The roses, the photograph, none of it. I don't remember who held the camera. I don't remember my hair being long. I don't remember being the girl you're describing. She's you. She was someone. They turned her into me. And I don't know how to be both." I wanted to cross the 3 feet. I wanted to close the distance, take her hands, hold her against me until the shaking stopped and the stillness softened, and the impossible, devastating weight of what I'd just told her became something she didn't have to carry alone. I stayed in the chair, because this was not my grief to absorb. It was hers. The first real grief she'd been given access to, the first time she'd been allowed to mourn the girl who'd been taken from her, and the mourning needed space. It needed the 3 feet. It needed the distance that said, I am here, and I will not leave, and I will not touch you until you ask, because your body has been a tool and a weapon and a vehicle for other people's purposes for so long that the only revolutionary act left is to let you decide who touches it. She decided. She stood up from the bed, crossed the 3 feet, stood in front of the chair where I was sitting, and I looked up at her, at the silver eyes and the short hair and the scar that climbed her neck, and the mouth that was not smiling, was nowhere close to smiling, was doing something that was the opposite of smiling, and just as vulnerable. And she put her hands on my shoulders. Don't say it, she said. Whatever you found, don't say it. I'm not worth your mind. The same words. The corridor. The tattoo traced in the dark. The refrain of a woman who'd been taught that her value was operational, and that anyone who valued her beyond that parameter was making a miscalculation she'd eventually have to survive the consequences of. I reached up and took her hands from my shoulders, held them. Her fingers were cold. She always ran cold, one of the 1,000 details I'd cataloged without permission or purpose, and I pressed them between my palms and felt her pulse beat against mine, and the 2 rhythms locked, and the distance became 0. That's not your decision, I said. She closed her eyes. I pulled her down, not roughly, gently, a gravitational suggestion, and she came, folding into the space between the chair's arms and my body, with a fluidity that suggested she'd been waiting to be asked, her forehead pressed against my collarbone, her hands curled against my chest. She was still shaking, or I was shaking, or the distinction between us had dissolved to the point where trembling was a shared condition rather than an individual symptom. I held her. Not like Hamburg. Not desperate, not bruising. Not the collision of 2 people who'd run out of alternatives. This was slower, quieter. The kind of holding that was its own language, that said in the pressure of arms and the synchronization of breath, you are here, you are real, the girl in the garden is not gone. She has been sleeping, and the 3 notes she hums in the dark are the sound of her trying to wake up. We stayed like that for a long time. The trains passed, the pub closed, the city dimmed. And somewhere in the small hours, when the silence had become comfortable enough to hold the weight of truth, she said, when? Not if. When. She'd understood the way she understood everything, silently, completely, with the pattern recognition precision of a mind that had been trained to see the shape of things before they happened, that I was going to speak her name, that no argument, no plea, no invocation of self-preservation would prevent it. That the decision had been made in a dark office 3 weeks ago, in front of a photograph of a girl with wild roses and an unguarded smile, and everything since had been logistics. When everything is in place, I said, when you have somewhere to go, when the extraction framework is solid, when Margot has the identity package ready. Her fingers tightened against my chest. And then they'll take you. Yes. And you'll come for me. Yes. And you won't know why you're coming. No. The silence was immense. Tidal. The kind of silence that exists in the seconds before a wave breaks. Suspended. Full of energy. The entire force of the ocean gathered into a single held breath. I'll wait for you, she said. I didn't understand. You can't wait. You have to run. The moment I speak it, the covenant activates. You need to be gone before. I'll wait for you, she said again, quieter this time. Not the operational directive I'd interpreted it as. Something else. A promise made to the man who was going to be erased. A promise that the woman who heard her name would not forget the one who'd spoken it, even if he forgot her. Even if the machine scrubbed her from his synapses and filled the space with targeting data and turned his love into a hunt, she would remember. She would wait. I pressed my mouth against her hair, closed my eyes. Outside, London slept. Inside, a man and a woman held each other in a rented flat above the railway arches and counted the hours they had left, and each hour felt like a year and a second simultaneously, the way time always feels when you know it's ending. In the morning, she was gone before I woke. The bed was cold. The flat was empty. On the kitchen counter, beside the kettle, she'd left a single thing, a small piece of paper, torn from the notepad by the phone, with 3 musical notes drawn on it in pencil. No words, no message, just the notes, the same 3 notes she hummed in her sleep, transcribed for the first time into a form that could be held, kept, carried. A melody to take into the white room. Something the machines couldn't erase because it lived in the space between language and feeling, in the territory below the cortical level, in the deep structures that Margot said the reconditioning wasn't built to reach. I folded the paper, put it in my pocket, and went to war. Chapter 7. The Name. Callum. The plan collapsed on a Tuesday. Not dramatically. Not in a single catastrophic failure, a blown cover, or an intercepted transmission, or a Covenant strike team kicking down a door. It collapsed the way structures collapse when the ground beneath them shifts, incrementally, then all at once, each small failure triggering the next in a cascade that was, in retrospect, inevitable from the moment I'd first opened a restricted archive and started looking for a ghost. Margot was compromised at 6:14. I received the alert through the dead drop communication system we'd established, a sequence of seemingly random modifications to a publicly accessible weather database that translated, through a cipher only the 2 of us knew, into a single word: burned. She'd been pulled from her operational duties, reassigned to an internal review panel, which was Covenant language for contained pending interrogation. Her access had been revoked. Her quarters had been searched. They hadn't found the identity package. She'd been smart enough to move it off-site before the net closed. But they'd found the transport schedules. They annotated security rotation data, enough to establish a pattern of unauthorized intelligence gathering that, combined with my own archive queries, drew a line between 2 points that even Crane's most junior analyst could follow. By 7 o'clock, my access to the internal network had been suspended. By 8:30, Hargrove's extension was ringing unanswered, which meant either he'd been reassigned or he was avoiding me, and both possibilities led to the same conclusion. By 9 o'clock, I was standing in my 4th-floor office with a phone that no longer connected to anything, a terminal that displayed only a lock screen, and the absolute clarifying certainty that the 11 days I'd thought I had were gone. All of them. Taken overnight by the quiet, efficient machinery of an organization that had been doing this longer than I'd been alive. I had hours, maybe less. I took the piece of paper from my pocket, the 3 notes, drawn in pencil on a scrap torn from a notepad in a Bermondsey flat. I looked at them. The pencil lines were already fading, softened by the warmth of my body and the friction of fabric, growing ghostly the way everything associated with her grew ghostly, as if the universe itself conspired to erase her. I folded the paper, put it back. Then I went to find her. She was not in her quarters. The door to the windowless room on sub-level 3 was open, not ajar, not 3 inches. Open, wide. The bed was made with military precision. The wardrobe was empty. The desk was clear. The mirror was still face down inside the wardrobe, but everything else, the few possessions a woman with no name accumulated over 6 years of institutional existence, was gone. She'd known before I had. Of course she had. Zero's operational instincts were sharper than mine by orders of magnitude. She'd read the shift in the building's rhythms, a changed guard rotation, an unusual presence on the security floor, the particular frequency of institutional tension that preceded a containment action. And she'd acted, cleared her quarters, moved to a position I couldn't predict because predicting her had never been one of my skills. But I knew where she'd go. Not because of training. Not because of the tactical analysis that the Covenant had spent 7 years hammering into my skull. Because of coffee and briefing pages in Edinburgh and the sound of 3 notes hummed in the dark. Because I'd spent weeks learning her not as an asset, but as a person. And the person had patterns that the operative didn't know she had. Unconscious gravitational pulls toward spaces that felt like safety, toward edges and margins and the places where the structure thinned enough to let the outside in. The east egress, the blind spot in the perimeter where the surveillance cameras didn't overlap. I took the stairs. She was waiting at the east service exit, a steel door that opened onto an alley behind the building. Black clothes, a bag over one shoulder, small, tactical, containing whatever a woman with no identity considered essential for disappearing. Her face was set in an expression I hadn't seen before. Not the mask, not the fortress, not the raw vulnerability of the Bermondsey flat. Something between all of them. A woman at the threshold of a door she'd been approaching for 6 years without knowing it, simultaneously ready and terrified and resolved. She saw me. "Margot's burned," she said. No preamble, no greeting. The operative's voice. Flat, efficient, already 3 steps ahead. I know. The identity package? Secure. Off-site. The dead drop in Southwark. The one I set up last week. She nodded. Processing. Calculating. Running the variables through the extraordinary machine of her tactical mind, and assembling, in real time, an extraction plan from the ruins of the one we'd built together. "We separate here," she said. "I'll collect the package and go to ground. You report back to the facility, claim you were running a standard morning perimeter check. Your access suspension is less than 3 hours old. Plausible deniability is thin, but viable. If you move now, before Crane escalates to formal containment, you can—" "No." She stopped. "Callum, I'm not going back." The words fell between us, like stones into deep water. She stared at me, and I watched the calculation happen. The rapid, precise assessment of what my refusal meant for her extraction plan, for her timeline, for the razor-thin margin of operational viability that separated survival from capture. And then, beneath the calculation, something else, the thing that wasn't operational, the thing that had no designation or classification. Fear, not for herself, for me. "You can't come with me," she said. "If you run, you're confirming everything Crane suspects. You become a target." "I'm already a target. The only variable left is whether I'm a target who gives you something before they take me, or one who doesn't." "Don't," she said. Our word, our refrain. "We need to move," I said. "Now, before the perimeter locks down." We moved. 0. We ran. Not literally. 2 people sprinting through Mayfair at 9 in the morning would draw exactly the wrong kind of attention. We walked. Fast, purposeful, with the practiced invisibility of 2 intelligence operatives who had spent their careers learning to move through urban spaces without leaving a wake. West, on Curzon Street. South, toward Green Park. Into the tube station, through the barriers, onto a Jubilee Line train that swallowed us into the city's circulatory system and carried us east. He stood close to me on the train, not touching, but close enough that I could feel the heat of his body through the layered air between us, close enough that the rhythm of the carriage's movement rocked us into occasional electrical contact, his shoulder against mine, his knuckle brushing my hand on the rail. Each point of contact was a detonation I couldn't afford, a distraction from the tactical calculations running through my mind at a speed that should have precluded anything as wasteful as emotion. Should have. Didn't. His phone buzzed at 10:17. He looked at the screen. His face didn't change, but I felt the shift, a tightening in his gait, a recalibration of his breathing, that told me the message was significant. "Crane's mobilized a recovery team," he said. 3 units. They'll have our last known position from the tube's CCTV within the hour. The Southwark dead drop. Compromised. If they're tracking our tube journey, they'll map the likely destinations. Southwark will be covered. The identity package. The passport. The banking access. Gone. The plan was collapsing around us like a house with its foundations cut, and we were standing in the wreckage on a pavement in East London with nothing left except each other, and a name he hadn't spoken. Callum. We ended up in Shadwell. Not by design, by the exhaustion of alternatives. The recovery teams were closing a net from the west, and our options had contracted with each passing minute until the territory available to us was a shrinking island of unwatched streets in the old docklands. The church was derelict. St. Matthias, Shadwell, deconsecrated, boarded up, awaiting a property developer who hadn't yet arrived. The alley behind it was narrow, cobblestoned, hemmed by high brick walls that smelled of damp and diesel and the Thames, which was close enough to hear a low, tidal murmur beneath the city's noise. It was raining. Of course it was raining. We stood in the alley behind the church, and I understood that we had run out of road. No identity package, no extraction route, no safe house, no clean legend, no 48 hours of viability. Margot was in a Covenant interrogation room. The careful framework I'd built, the architecture of her escape, was rubble. All that remained was the name. She was leaning against the brick wall of the churchyard, rain darkening her hair and running down her face in thin silver lines. She looked exhausted, not operational exhaustion, soul level, the exhaustion of a woman who had spent 6 years being no one and 3 weeks being almost someone, and was now standing in a dead-end alley, watching the last possibility of a life evaporate. She looked at me. She knew. I could see it in her face. The recognition, the understanding, the slow and terrible dawning of what I was about to do. "No," she said, quietly, a plea. "Callum, no." "The plan is gone," I said. "The identity package is compromised. The extraction framework is rubble. In 30 minutes, maybe less, Crane's teams will have this grid locked down and we will have nothing. Then we run. We improvise. I've disappeared before without infrastructure. I can do it again." "And then what?" "You disappear again. Another name that isn't yours. You spend the rest of your life being a fiction, while the real you stays locked inside the Covenant's archive, sealed behind a protocol designed to make sure you never exist. At least you'd be intact, functional, recalibrated." The word tasted like acid. Crane's word. What good is my mind if it's the price of your erasure? She hit me. Not a slap, a fist, closed, driven into the center of my chest. The impact was solid, professional. She'd been trained to kill with those hands, and the fact that the blow was a fraction of what she was capable of made it more devastating, not less. She was holding back, fighting me with restraint even in the act of trying to save my life. "You don't get to do this," she said. Her voice had broken open, not into tears, not into the crying she couldn't do, but into something raw, a register I'd never heard. The voice of the girl who'd tattooed her own name on her wrist at 15. "You don't get to decide that your mind is worth less than my name. It's my choice. It destroys you. It proves you exist." The rain fell. "The alley held us," the Thames murmured, and the distance between us ceased to be a distance. She was against me, not kissing me, hitting me, both fists now against my chest, not with the force of an operative, but with the desperate, uncoordinated violence of a woman trying to physically prevent something she knew she couldn't stop. Each blow landed lighter than the last, losing force, losing coherence, until the hitting became something else, her fists opening against my chest, her palms flat, her fingers gripping the fabric of my jacket, and she was not hitting me anymore. She was holding on to me, and the holding was a sound I'd never heard her make, a sound between a breath and a break. The closest thing to crying that her reconditioning damaged neurology could produce. I held her. One last time. In the rain, in the alley, behind a derelict church in Shadwell, with the Thames breathing and the city closing in, and the clock running down on the man I was, I held her. I pressed my mouth against her temple. I breathed in the scent of her rain-soaked hair, rosemary, thyme, the garden she didn't remember. I felt her heartbeat against my chest, fast and frantic and alive, so alive, the most alive thing I had ever held. And I said her name. Not loudly, not defiantly. I whispered it. Into the curve of her ear, beneath the sound of the rain, in a voice that was steady and sure and full of everything I would lose in the next 6 hours and everything she would gain in the next 6 seconds. 5 letters. A garden name. A lullaby name. The name a mother chooses because it sounds like a wish. It left my lips and entered the air between us, and the air changed, the molecules rearranged. The rain, for one impossibly still fraction of a second, seemed to pause, suspended, each drop a tiny lens catching the gray light, the world holding its breath around a word that had been buried for 8 years and was now, finally, free. She heard it. I watched it happen. Watched the name travel from the air into her ear, into whatever deep, sealed, unreachable part of her brain still held the memory of being called by it. Her whole body went rigid, not with fear, not with the flinch I'd seen at the breaking mug, but with something seismic. Recognition, not cognitive. She didn't remember. But something below cognition, below memory, below the cortical architecture. Her limbic system. Her amygdala. The deep structures that Margot had said might survive. They heard it. And her face. Her face transformed. Not a smile. Something beyond smiling. A recognition so profound, it bypassed expression entirely and went straight to the architecture of her features, rearranging them at a level that was almost geological. The fortress didn't fall. It dissolved, as if it had been made of ice, and the name was a season. For one crystalline, perfect, irreplaceable moment, she was whole. The girl and the weapon, the name and the designation, the garden and the concrete room, all of it fused. She was one person, complete, witnessed, known. And then my head split open. 0. I heard my name. For the first time. For the last time. A whisper against my ear. 5 letters in the voice of a man who was choosing to burn for them. And the sound went through me like light through water. Like electricity through a circuit that had been dead so long I'd forgotten it was wired. I heard my name and I was real. For 3 seconds. 4. A span of time so small, it shouldn't have been able to contain everything it contained. The garden and the roses and my mother's piano and the girl I'd been, and the woman I'd become, and the man holding me in the rain who had just traded his mind for my existence. Then I watched it start. The reconditioning trigger was not the instant, violent thing I'd imagined. Not a switch being thrown. It was slower, incremental. A tide coming in. His hands on my arms tightened first. Not an embrace, a grip. The quality of the contact changed, shifting from tenderness to something mechanical, the muscles recalibrating from holding to restraining. I felt the shift in his fingertips, the pressure increasing, the gentleness draining out of it like warmth draining from a cooling body. His breathing changed. The rhythm that I'd memorized, 12 cycles per minute, the cadence I'd tracked through Edinburgh nights and Hamburg dawns, accelerated, became shallow, irregular, the breathing of a man whose autonomic nervous system was being rewritten in real time. I pulled back to look at his face. His eyes. Oh God, his eyes. They were still hazel, still deep-set, still set in the face I'd learned to read the way navigators read stars, but something behind them was changing. The recognition, that steady, devastating knowledge that had said I know who you are, was dimming, flickering. Like a signal being jammed, the original transmission, still detectable beneath the interference, but growing weaker with each passing second. Callum! His name in my mouth, the one thing I could give him in return for the thing he'd given me. He blinked, focused. For a moment, one guttering, desperate moment, he was there. The real him. The man who drank coffee with a splash of milk, and slept at crooked angles on sofas, and whose hands shook when they stitched me together. "Run," he said. His voice was wrong, thinner, as if the substance of it, the warmth, the Glasgow undertone, the particular resonance I'd associated with safety, was being siphoned away. "Callum, listen to me. Fight it. Whatever the trigger is doing, you can." His hand closed around my wrist. Not the way he'd touched me in the dark room, tracing the tattoo with reverence. This was clinical. The grip of a man assessing the tensile strength of a target's skeletal structure. I saw the moment the assessment happened. Saw his eyes drop to my wrist, and then to my neck, and then to the tactical geometry of our position, and the gaze that tracked these points was not the gaze of a man in love. It was the gaze of an operative calculating an approach vector. He was evaluating me as a target. I broke his grip. Wrist rotation, downward pressure, his hold released. He stepped back. Not a retreat, but a tactical reset, his body reorienting into a combative's posture. Balanced, centered, ready. The man I loved was standing 6 feet away from me in the rain, and the distance between us was no longer a choice. It was a battleground. Callum. I said it again. His name, a rope thrown into the dark. Please. A flicker, a tremor in his jaw, a micro-hesitation in the blankness, as if somewhere beneath the programming, in the deep structures, the amygdala, the limbic territories Margot had said might survive. Something heard me. But the tremor passed, the blankness smoothed, and the man in the alley took a step toward me that was not a step toward me. It was a step toward the target. I ran, not from fear, not from survival instinct. I ran from mercy. Because I knew, with the same bone-deep certainty with which I knew my 3 notes and my ruined tattoo and the shape of his sleeping face, that if I stayed, he would kill me. And if he killed me, whatever fragment of Callum survived beneath the programming would have to live with it. Would surface one day in a white room or a dark corridor, and would remember that his hands, the hands that had stitched her wound and traced her name and shaken with the effort of caring too much, had been the ones to end her. I would not give the Covenant that victory. I would not let them use his love to destroy what his love had given me. So I ran. Through the alley, past the derelict church, into the maze of Shadwell's streets, where the architecture folded in on itself and the surveillance cameras thinned to nothing. I ran with my name ringing in my skull. 5 letters, a garden, a wish, and the sound of his footsteps behind me, already following, already calculating, already hunting, with the devastating efficiency of a weapon built from the blueprint of everything he'd ever learned about the woman he'd loved. I ran and I did not look back, because looking back would have shown me his face, and his face would have been blank, and the blankness would have broken me in ways that 6 years of institutional dehumanization had never managed. He had given me myself, and the cost was himself. And the cruelty was that only one of us would remember, Callum. The asset escaped. That was the first coherent thought, clean, precise, unencumbered by context or emotion or the inexplicable ache that pulsed behind his sternum like a bruise he couldn't locate. Covenant recovery operatives found him 17 minutes later, standing in the alley behind St. Matthias Shadwell. The rain had plastered his hair to his forehead. His jacket was disheveled, his eyes were clear. "Status?" the team leader asked. "The asset escaped. I'll find her." His voice was flat, professional, the voice of a strategist delivering a field report. They brought a vehicle. He sat in the back. The city scrolled past the tinted windows, gray, wet, unremarkable. He processed the visual data automatically. Traffic patterns, pedestrian density, potential choke points. Standard analytical function. Nothing unusual. Nothing unusual except the hand. His right hand, resting on his thigh, hidden from the operatives in the front seats by the angle of his body. His right hand was trembling. A fine, persistent tremor, not operational, not cold, not adrenaline. Something else. Something that had no designation and no classification and no place in the architecture of the weapon he was becoming. In his pocket, a piece of paper, folded. He didn't know what it contained. The operational part of his mind flagged it as irrelevant, a scrap, a remnant, something to be discarded during post-deployment inventory. He didn't discard it. He didn't know why. Chapter 8. Reclamation. Ilara. My name was Ilara. I said it to myself on the train from Waterloo. Silently, at first, mouthing the syllables against the glass of the window, while the outskirts of London blurred past in a smear of gray and green. Then, under my breath, so quiet that the elderly woman sleeping in the seat across from me didn't stir. Then again, louder, the word forming fully in my mouth for the first time with no one watching, no church walls to hold it, no man's hands on my face to anchor it. Ilara. 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 Each repetition unlocked something. Not like a door opening. Callum had described it that way in the Bermondsey flat, when he'd told me about reading my name on a screen for the first time. For him it had been a door. For me it was more like ice melting. A slow, thermal process. The name was warmth, and the warmth was seeping into the frozen architecture of my memory, and wherever it reached, things began to thaw. The garden came first. Not as a complete image, not the photograph Callum had described, the girl with the long hair and the unguarded smile. It came as fragments, sensory shards. The texture of stone beneath my bare feet, warm from an afternoon sun. The smell of earth after rain, petrichor, the word surfaced with the memory, a word someone had taught me, someone whose voice I could almost hear. The color of the roses, not red, but a deep, saturated pink that was closer to the inside of a seashell than to any rose I'd seen in a florist's window. Wild roses. Climbing a wall. My mother's wall. The word arrived and detonated. Mother. I pressed my forehead against the train window and closed my eyes and felt the word expand inside me like a shockwave, rearranging everything it touched. I had a mother. I had a mother who'd grown roses on a stone wall and taught me the word petrichor and the piano. The three notes. They'd been hers, a lullaby. She'd played it on an upright piano in a room with low ceilings and a window that faced the sea. Not the ocean, not the vast, dramatic, cinematic sea, but the quiet, gray, persistently beautiful sea of a coastline I now recognized with a specificity that made my chest contract. Cornwall. The North Coast. Near Tintagel, where the cliffs were black and the wind tasted like salt and the light in winter was the color of hammered silver. I'd grown up there. I'd been taken from there. The memories came faster now, each one triggering the next in a cascade that was part exhilaration and part agony, because every fragment I recovered was also a measure of what had been stolen, a line item in an inventory of loss so comprehensive that the mind recoiled from totaling it. A kitchen with a flagstone floor. A cat, gray, imperious, named after a Greek island whose name I couldn't yet retrieve. A school bag, navy blue, with a keychain in the shape of a lighthouse. My mother's hands on the piano keys, her fingers long and sure, the same fingers I'd inherited, the same fingers that had driven cheap ink into my own wrist in a desperate, teenage attempt to save the name those hands had given me. Ilara. She'd named me after a moon of Jupiter, the smallest and closest of the inner satellites, discovered in 1905, named for a figure in Greek mythology who'd been seduced by Zeus and punished by Hera. A moon, a myth, a girl who'd been desired by a god and destroyed for it. My mother had a dark sense of humor, or a gift for prophecy. I changed trains at Exeter, then again at Plymouth, then a local service that wound along the coast, the tracks curving between hills and sea, and with each mile the memories grew denser, more vivid, more painful, until by the time the train pulled into a village station, whose name I read on the platform sign and recognized with a jolt that was almost physical, I was crying again. The mechanism Callum had restored in the church was functioning with the relentless efficiency of a system catching up on 6 years of deferred maintenance. I cried on the train. I cried on the platform. I cried walking down a lane I hadn't seen since I was 15, past hedgerows I'd once known the names of every plant in, toward a house I could now see in my mind before my eyes found it in the landscape. Stone walls, slate roof, the climbing roses bare in winter, but their thorny architecture still clinging to the mortar. The cottage. My mother's cottage. It was empty. I'd expected that the Covenant would have cleaned the site after my acquisition, erased the traces of the girl who'd lived there the way they'd erased the girl herself. But the structure was intact. Owned, according to the land registry I'd checked on a library computer in Exeter, by a holding company that had paid the council tax annually for 6 years and done nothing else. The Covenant, maintaining the property not out of sentiment, but out of operational thoroughness. A contingency. A loose end too minor to eliminate, but too significant to sell. I broke in through the kitchen window. The house smelled like dust and cold stone, and, beneath that, something I couldn't identify until I was standing in the sitting room with my hands at my sides and tears on my face and the late afternoon light falling through curtains that hadn't been opened in years. Wood smoke, the ghost of it. Embedded in the walls, in the curtains, in the fibers of the carpet, a decade of winter fires, the scent baked into the molecular structure of the house itself, surviving vacancy and neglect, and the passage of time, because some things are too deeply embedded to be removed by anything short of demolition. Like a name driven into skin with cheap ink and a sewing needle, like 3 notes of a lullaby, hummed in the dark by a woman who didn't know she was remembering. The piano was gone, the furniture was gone, but the flagstone floor was the same, and the window still faced the sea, and when I pressed my palm against the wall where the roses climbed outside, I could feel the vibration of the wind through the stone, and the vibration felt like a heartbeat, and the heartbeat felt like home. I sat on the floor of my mother's kitchen, and, for the first time in my life, not my operational life, not my covenant life, but my actual, human, named life, I grieved. For the girl, for the mother, for the piano and the cat and the school bag and the 15 years of selfhood that had been extracted from me with the clinical efficiency of an organ harvest, for the 6 years of absence that followed, for the man in the church who'd given it all back to me in 5 letters and was now being rewritten into the instrument of my destruction. I grieved until the light failed and the house went dark, and the only sound was the wind off the sea and the rhythm of my own breathing, no longer the controlled 12 cycles per minute respiration of operative zero, but something messier, deeper, interrupted by sobs that came in waves and didn't care about operational parameters. Ilara Voss grieved, and then she stopped, and started planning. He was coming. I'd known he would. The Covenant's operational logic was predictable. I should know. I'd been its primary instrument for 6 years. A containment target with known biographical connections would be tracked through those connections. My file, which Callum had read in its entirety, contained the address of this cottage. It would be among the first locations flagged for search. But I'd also been trained by the best strategist the Covenant had ever employed. Callum's operational frameworks were in my muscle memory now. The decision trees, the risk matrices, the elegant, systematic approach to threat assessment that I'd absorbed during weeks of briefings and planning sessions, and the quiet, devastating intimacy of learning how another person's mind worked. I knew how he'd come for me. I knew his search patterns, his prioritization heuristics, the way he weighted geographical probability against biographical significance. He'd start with the major transit hubs, Waterloo, Gatwick, the locations associated with the escape infrastructure he'd built, and when those yielded nothing, he'd move to secondary targets, known associates, historical residences, the places where the girl I'd been might instinctively return to, pulled by a gravity that no amount of operational training could fully override. Cornwall would be on the list. It would take him 4 days, maybe 5. The Covenant's resources were vast, but not infinite, and the false trails he'd laid during the escape planning would slow the institutional response, even as they accelerated his individual pursuit. The reconditioned Callum would cut through the noise faster than the bureaucracy, because he knew me, knew my patterns, my instincts, the particular way I moved through the world. Intimacy as tactical advantage, the cruelest design feature of the protocol. I used the time. I contacted Margot. Not directly. Margot was still in Covenant custody, but the internal communication infrastructure had vulnerabilities I'd identified years ago and never reported, because the woman who called herself Zero had understood, at a level below conscious strategy, that someday she might need an exit. I routed an encrypted query through a decommissioned relay node on the facility's legacy network, the same infrastructure Callum had used to find my file, and received 18 hours later a response from an IP address I recognized as Margot's personal terminal on sublevel 2. She'd been released, administrative suspension lifted. Crane had extracted what he needed, confirmation that Callum had found the file, had spoken the name, had been reconditioning, triggered as designed, and had determined that Margot's involvement, while insubordinate, did not constitute a structural threat to the organization. She was on probation, monitored, but functional. Her message was brief. The reconditioning has a flaw. Emotional imprints in deep limbic structures can survive. The programming suppresses, it doesn't destroy. If the emotional stimulus is strong enough and specific enough, the suppressed architecture can reassert itself. It's not recovery. It's more like an echo. The original signal, bleeding through the interference. You need to reach the signal before the interference becomes permanent. The window is narrow. Days. Maybe a week. After that, the neural pathways consolidate, and the reconditioning becomes structural. He's being deployed tomorrow. Target, you. He'll reach Cornwall within 72 hours. I'm sorry, Alara, for everything. For the 15 years I was too afraid to say your name. I read the message 3 times. Then I deleted it and began preparing the house. He came on the 5th day. I heard the car before I saw it. A rental, dark-colored, moving slowly down the lane with the controlled deceleration of a driver who was surveilling the approach rather than simply arriving. Late afternoon. The sky was the color of pewter, heavy with unshed rain, and the wind off the sea carried the salt and mineral scent of a coastline bracing for a storm. I was in the kitchen. The door was open. I'd left it open deliberately, not as a lure, as a statement, a refusal to hide. The girl who'd grown up in this house had walked through that door 10,000 times, and the woman who'd come back to it was not going to cower behind it. He appeared in the doorway, and my heart stopped, not metaphorically, a literal arrhythmia, a skipped beat, a syncopation in the rhythm that had been steady and controlled for 6 years, and was now, in the presence of a man wearing the face of someone she loved, and the expression of someone who didn't know her, failing. He looked the same. That was the cruelty. The same dark blonde hair, the same shadowed jaw, the same lean height that had filled doorways and corridors, and the space beside her in a way that made every other configuration of a room feel incomplete. He was wearing dark clothes, tactical, not the suits he'd worn at the facility. His posture was different, squared, centered, the weight distributed for movement rather than conversation, the posture of a man on a mission. But his eyes were wrong. They swept the room the way mine had swept the briefing room on the day we'd met. Threat assessment, exit points, weapon reach. They found me and cataloged me with the flat, efficient precision of an operative evaluating a target. No recognition, no warmth, no hazel depth, just surface, just function, just the machine. He had a weapon, I could see it, a compact sidearm, holstered at his hip, the retention strap unfastened, ready for a draw that would take him less than a second. Operative Zero, he said. Not my name, my designation. The word that had replaced my name, spoken in a voice that was his and wasn't. The Glasgow accent flattened to nothing, the warmth stripped out, the timbre altered by whatever chemical and electrical processes the white room had performed on the vocal centers of his brain. I didn't run. I said his name. Callum. Nothing. No flicker. No tremor. The flat eyes regarded me with the professional detachment of a man fulfilling a work order. I said it again. Callum Rice. Glasgow. You slept in a drainage ditch in Cobble in 2019. You drink your coffee with a splash of milk. You have a scar on your lower lip shaped like a crescent moon, and you got it. I didn't know how he'd got it. He'd never told me. There were so many things he'd never told me. So many conversations we'd never had because we'd spent our time building escape routes instead of histories, and the loss of those unspoken stories felt, in this moment, like its own species of grief. You are being detained, he said. The words were procedural, recited. You will accompany me to... You asked me once if I preferred tea or coffee, I said. My voice was steady. I was drawing on every reserve of composure I'd built over 6 years of operational performance, because the woman standing in this kitchen needed to be Zero and Alara simultaneously. The operative's control and the girl's heart, fused into something that could withstand the sight of the man she loved looking at her with empty eyes and a gun on his hip. It was my first day. You sat across from me in briefing room 4, sub-level 2, and you asked me my preferences. Tea or coffee, window or aisle, whether I sleep on planes. No one had asked me a question like that in 3 years. And I said coffee. Black. I said I don't sleep on planes. And you didn't make a note of it. You just remembered. His jaw tightened. Barely. A millimeter of movement. A contraction in the masseter muscle that lasted less than a second and would have been invisible to anyone who hadn't spent weeks memorizing the topography of that face. But I'd spent weeks memorizing the topography of that face. You brought me coffee every morning after that, I continued, stepping closer. 1 step. The 3 feet. Our meridian. Black, no sugar. 3 inches from my right hand. You oriented the briefing pages for left-handed reading because you'd noticed I was left-handed. You noticed everything. You noticed the tattoo on my wrist. You noticed I flinch at breaking sounds. You noticed I hum in my sleep. Another step. His hand moved toward the holster. Reflex, the machine's response to a closing threat perimeter. But the hand stopped. Halfway to the weapon. Suspended. The fingers extended, then curled, then extended again. The same 2-instruction conflict I'd seen in the church. The man and the machine, fighting for the same tendons. 3 notes, I said. I was 2 feet away now, close enough to see the pulse in his throat. Close enough to see the fine sheen of sweat on his temples that hadn't been there 30 seconds ago. Close enough to see that behind the flat surface of his eyes, something was moving. Not surfacing, not yet, but stirring. A disturbance in the deep water, a tremor in the bedrock. You told me in Edinburgh. You told me in the corridor outside briefing room 4. You said I hum 3 notes in my sleep, and I don't know what they are, but my body does. I was close enough to touch him. I didn't. Instead, I hummed. 3 notes. The lullaby. My mother's lullaby, played on an upright piano in a cottage by the sea, carried through 6 years of erasure and reconditioning in a part of my brain that the machines hadn't been built to reach. I hummed the 3 notes, and I said my name. Ilara. Not a weapon, not a trigger, an invitation. Remember me, remember us, come back. He seized. The word is inadequate, but it's what happened. His body went rigid, every muscle engaging simultaneously, a full system spasm that dropped him to his knees on the flagstone floor. His hands hit the stone. His head bowed. A sound came from him that was not a word or a scream, but something between a tearing, a rending, the auditory equivalent of a structure being pulled apart from the inside by 2 opposing forces of equal and irresistible magnitude. I caught him. I went down with him, knees on the cold stone, hands on his shoulders, holding him the way you hold something that is breaking, and might become something new if you can keep the pieces together long enough for the new shape to form. He was shaking, the deep, structural tremor, the earthquake, the full-body seismology of a nervous system in revolt against its own programming. Blood appeared at his nose, a thin line, bright against his skin, tracking down his upper lip, then his ears, a darker trickle, slower. The reconditioning's architecture, fighting the deconditioning's assault, neural pathways burning and rebuilding and burning again in a war, fought at the cellular level, invisible to the eye, but devastating to the body that contained it. I held him. I held him on the floor of my mother's kitchen, and I talked. Not about operations, not about the covenant, not about the protocol, or the white room, or the architecture of the machine that had unmade him. I talked about coffee, about briefing pages oriented for left-handed reading, about a broken percolator in an Edinburgh safe house, and the way he'd looked at it with personal affront, as if the appliance had betrayed him specifically, about the sofa that was too short, and the drainage ditch in Kabul, and the crescent moon scar on his lip that I'd never asked about and wished I had. I talked about the corridor, about the 3 feet, about the word stay, murmured in his sleep, and the 3 notes he'd heard me hum, and the tattoo he'd traced in the dark with a finger that was steadier than mine. I talked about Homburg, about his shaking hands, about the way I'd grabbed his wrist to steady him, and the way he'd looked up at me from the bathroom floor, and the kiss that was not a kiss but a detonation, and the way I'd pushed him away because I was afraid, and the way he'd let me go because he understood that letting me go was the only way to prove he wouldn't hold on too tight. I talked about the Bermondsey flat, about the railway arches, about his hands around mine, and the 3-foot distance collapsing to 0, and the question, when, not if, and the promise I'd made, and immediately broken. I'll wait for you. But I'm lying. I wasn't lying. I waited. I was waiting now on the cold flagstone floor with his blood on my hands and his body convulsing against mine, and the wind screaming off the Cornish sea through a house that smelled like wood smoke and dust, and the ghost of a life that had been stolen and was now, fragment by fragment, memory by memory, name by name, being reassembled. The shaking slowed. The bleeding slowed. His breathing changed. The flat, mechanical rhythm of the reconditioned operative fracturing, disintegrating, replaced by something uneven and desperate and alive. The breathing of a man surfacing from deep water, lungs burning, reaching for air. His hand found my wrist. Not my throat. My wrist. The left one. The one with the tattoo. His fingers settled on the ruined letters with the same light, precise, devastating touch he'd used in my quarters on sub-level 3, in the blue-green dark, when he'd traced the ghost of my name on my skin and held the real one behind his teeth. He looked up at me, and the hazel was there. Not all of it, not the full, warm, autumn depth that I'd learned to read like a language and love like a country. But enough. A glimmer in the shallow water. A light in the deep structure. The man beneath the machine, pushing through the interference, reaching toward the signal. He opened his mouth. The sound that came out was broken, barely a word. The syllables fractured and reassembled mid-delivery, as if the speech centers of his brain were still contested territory, still being fought over by the 2 architectures, the one that had been built over 6 hours in a white room, and the one that had been built over 6 weeks of coffee and silence and 3-foot distances, and the slow, devastating, irreversible process of learning to love someone. But I heard it. My name. Spoken from the floor of my mother's kitchen, broken, barely audible, missing a consonant, slurring a vowel, so damaged by the journey it had taken through the wreckage of his neural architecture that anyone else would have heard only noise. I didn't hear noise. I heard him. I pressed my forehead against his. His skin was hot, feverish. The metabolic cost of what his brain had just done, rejecting a conditioning protocol designed to be permanent, rebuilding neural pathways that had been chemically destroyed, routing emotional memory through structures that the machines hadn't been built to reach, was being paid by the body, and the price was steep. But he was paying it. He was here. He was saying my name. "Ilara," I said, "my name is Ilara, and you're Colum, and this is my mother's house. And you're gonna be all right." I didn't know if that was true. I said it anyway, because some words are not descriptions of reality. They are instructions. They are the shape you hold up in front of the chaos and say, "This is what we're building. This is what we're choosing. This is what I refuse to let the world take from us, no matter how many white rooms it builds, or how many machines it invents, or how many names it tries to bury." I held him on the floor. The storm broke. Rain hit the windows. The wind carried the sound of the sea into the house through gaps in the stone. And we stayed. Epilogue. After Callum. Some mornings I forgot her name. Not for long. Seconds, usually. Occasionally a minute. A brief, vertiginous gap in the architecture of my mind. A room I walked into and found empty, the furniture gone, the walls bare, the window looking out onto a landscape I recognized but couldn't name. A held breath, a missing step on a staircase I'd descended 1,000 times. And then it came back. Not gently, never gently. It came back the way the sea comes back to a shore it's been pulled from, with force, with fullness, with the accumulated weight of everything it carried. 5 letters, flooding into the empty room, filling it floor to ceiling, restoring the furniture and the view and the name on the door. And I'd breathe, and the world would re-solidify around me. And I'd say it out loud, to the morning, to the walls, to the woman in the bed beside me, who was already awake because she was always awake first. Ilara. She'd turn her head on the pillow, silver eyes, still sharp, still carrying the operational precision that 6 months of freedom hadn't softened. But the sharpness was different now. It assessed out of habit, not necessity. It scanned the room not for threats, but for the particular geography of a life she was still learning to inhabit, the dresser she'd chosen, the curtain she'd hung, the stack of second-hand books on the nightstand that she was reading not for intelligence, but for pleasure. She'd look at me. She'd see the residual panic in my eyes, the shadow of the gap, the echo of the empty room, and she'd understand because she always understood, because reading me was the first language she'd learned that she hadn't been forced to. "I'm here," she'd say. And that was enough. The cottage was on the Scottish coast, not Glasgow. I wasn't ready for Glasgow, might never be. Farther north. A village small enough that the postman knew every resident by name, and the nearest town required a 20-minute drive along a single-track road flanked by heather and sheep, and the kind of landscape that looked like God had started painting and wandered off before finishing. The cottage was stone, 2 bedrooms, a kitchen, a sitting room with a wood-burning stove that I fed every evening with logs from the stack behind the house. The windows faced west, toward the sea, and on clear evenings the sunset turned the water to hammered copper and the sky to a bruise of violet and amber that neither of us ever got tired of watching. We'd found it in February, 6 weeks after Cornwall. 6 weeks of moving, from the cottage in Tintagel, to a series of temporary locations, rentals and safe houses, and the homes of contacts who owed favors and didn't ask questions. She'd driven. I couldn't in those early weeks. The reconditioning's aftermath had left me with episodes, moments where my vision doubled, where my hands performed actions my mind hadn't authorized, where I'd reach for a glass of water and find myself gripping it hard enough to crack the ceramic, the fingers obeying an instruction set that had been overwritten but not fully deleted. She'd pry the glass from my hand, gently, without comment. She'd replace it with hers. The recovery was not linear. There were good days. Days when the name was there from the moment I woke, solid and present, and the gaps in my memory were small enough to step over without looking down. Days when I could hold a cup without breaking it, and drive to the village for supplies, and read a book for an hour without losing the thread. And there were bad days. Days when the empty room lasted not seconds, but minutes. When I'd stand in the kitchen staring at the woman across from me, and know, with absolute, visceral certainty that she mattered, that she was the axis around which my entire existence now rotated, and simultaneously be unable to retrieve the word that described her. Not her name, the word love. The emotional vocabulary itself, temporarily disrupted, as if the reconditioning had damaged not just specific memories, but the broader infrastructure of feeling, leaving me with the sensation of an emotion whose label had been peeled away. On those days, she was patient. She'd sit across from me at the kitchen table, the same configuration, always facing each other, 3 feet of pine between us, an echo of every briefing room we'd shared, and she'd talk. Not urgently, not therapeutically. She'd talk the way she hummed. From the deep structures, from the place below language where communication is rhythm and presence, and the simple animal reassurance of a familiar voice in a quiet room. She'd tell me things, recovered memories, offered like gifts, the cat's name, Naxos, after the Greek island, her mother's recipe for soda bread, reconstructed from fragments, still imperfect. The sound of the waves at Tintagel in winter, which she said was not a crash but a conversation, the sea talking to the cliffs in a language older than anything they could decipher. She'd tell me about herself, the person she was becoming, now that she had a name to build on. She liked mornings. She liked the smell of wood smoke, and the weight of a heavy blanket, and the particular shade of gray the sky turned just before rain. She didn't like crowds, or loud music, or the sound of glass breaking, though the flinch was getting smaller. She was learning to cook, badly, with a determination that I found more moving than any operational excellence she'd ever displayed. She was growing her hair. Not long, not yet, but past the brutal operational crop she'd maintained for 6 years. It touched her collar now, curled slightly at the ends, and the auburnness of it, a color I'd only seen in a photograph, flat and digital, light years from the living reality, caught the light in a way that made my chest ache with a sweetness I hadn't known I was capable of. She still slept with a knife under her pillow. I still had episodes where my right hand clenched without my permission. We were not healed. But we were here. Margot sent encrypted updates every 2 weeks. The news was never good, but it was useful. Crane was consolidating. The Covenant had reclassified both of us, me as a compromised asset, her as a rogue operative. The institutional machinery was turning, slowly, grinding toward a response that would eventually reach us no matter how far north we ran, or how small the village, or how convincing the legends Margot had built. This was not over. We both knew it. We didn't talk about it often, not because the knowledge was unbearable, but because there was something more important to do first. The daily, painstaking, extraordinarily ordinary work of becoming people, of building a life from scratch in a cottage on a coast, with no operational mandates and no institutional architecture, and nothing to guide us except the unprecedented, terrifying, exhilarating challenge of deciding each morning what to do with a day that belonged entirely to us. Some mornings we walked along the cliffs, into the village, down to the beach, where the tide left patterns in the sand that looked like the topographical maps we'd once used to plan extractions. She'd point them out. I'd laugh. The laughter was still a new sound between us, unexpected, slightly startling, like a bird that had wandered into a room and couldn't find the window. But it was there, and it was growing. Some mornings she played piano. We'd found one in the village, an old upright, out of tune, donated to the community hall by a family that had moved south. I'd arranged to have it brought to the cottage. It sat against the west wall of the sitting room, facing the window that faced the sea, and she'd play in the early mornings while I built the fire. She was relearning. Her mother's lullaby first. The 3 notes expanding, session by session, into a melody she reconstructed from fragments of muscle memory and recovered feeling. It was halting, imperfect, full of pauses where the fingers searched for notes that the mind couldn't yet supply. It was the most beautiful thing I'd ever heard. This morning, I woke before her. Rare. She was almost always first, the sentinel instinct, the shallow sleep architecture that was softening but not gone. But today, I surfaced first, rising through the layers of sleep into the gray pre-dawn light that filled the bedroom like water filling a bowl, slowly, evenly, without temperature. She was beside me. On her side, facing the window, one hand curled beneath the pillow, where the knife was, always, a habit I'd stopped asking her to change, because some architectures are load-bearing, and you don't dismantle them until the structure is ready to stand without them. Her hair on the pillow, the auburn of it dark in the low light. The sleeve of her shirt, she slept in long sleeves, still, always, had ridden up past her wrist. The tattoo. Faded, scarred, the letters illegible to anyone who didn't already know what they said. I knew what they said. I reached across the narrow distance between us, not 3 feet now, not even 1, just the few inches of mattress that separated her body from mine in sleep, and I touched the tattoo. One finger. The same finger I'd used in a dark room on sub-level 3, in the blue-green glow of a terminal's standby light, to trace the ghost of a name I'd found by dismantling every wall an institution had built to keep it from me. She didn't wake, but she moved. A small shift, a gravitational adjustment, her body drifting toward the point of contact, the way a compass needle drifts toward north, not a decision, but an orientation, an alignment with the thing that mattered most. I leaned close, and I said her name. Into the curve of her neck, into the warmth between her hair and her skin, into the small, sacred space where breath becomes language, and language becomes something older than words. Ilaura. She didn't open her eyes. But her hand, the one not under the pillow, the free one, the one she'd used to steady my wrist in Hamburg, and pound my chest in the church, and hold mine on the floor of her mother's kitchen, found mine. Her fingers laced through my fingers, her grip tightened, and she held on. The same way I'd held on to those 3 notes in the white room. The same way she'd held on to her own name with cheap ink and a sewing needle and a stubbornness that had outlasted every machine they'd built to break it. She held on. Outside, the sea talked to the cliffs. The light grew. The morning arrived in its quiet, extraordinary, unremarkable way. The way mornings arrive when they belong to people who have chosen each other over safety, over sanity, over the institutional certainty that human connection is a vulnerability to be exploited rather than a force to be reckoned with. I'd burn for it again, every time, without hesitation, because some names are not meant to be forgotten. They are meant to be fought for. The end.